Hello to all of the real progressives out there. Thank you so much for tuning in today. As always, I think we have an absolutely fantastic show for everybody. I wanted to start with the RP plugs as usual. Please make sure to go to realprogressives.org if you want to find out more about us, learn about our organization, or contribute. You can become a patron there. All of our content, articles, podcasts, etc., you can find at our website, realprogressives.org. Make sure not to miss the new show from our founder and CEO, Steve Grumbine, the Rogue Scholar. First episode just dropped last week with friend of RP, Jeff Ginter. It was fantastic. You can also catch his podcast, Macro and Cheese. Make sure not to miss the Up and Up with Jody Newell, which is centered around activism, talking to political activists across the country. And MMT Mondays with Jabari Morris. New episode tomorrow explaining economic concepts through a modern monetary theory lens. And you can always catch me on Sundays as well, with current events and political commentary. Thanks, everybody, for tuning in. So I wanted to start just by briefly discussing the hysteria surrounding January 6th and how the media seem to center in on it in a way that most everyday people do not seem to, care. And I think there's a really simple and obvious reason for that. I think that the last time that cable news channels and mainstream outlets saw decent ratings was on January 6th of 2021. So it's pretty natural for them to just grasp onto that and refuse to let go, right? It's also a convenient narrative. It plays right down the conflict lines that they want to exploit for viewership. So it's natural for them to highlight it. But and I didn't want to show any clips and glorify what they were doing here, but I saw a couple where journalists were trying to make it all about them, and how horrible it was for them to be there and this and that. And guys, I don't mean to minimize. I'm sure for some people that was a terrifying day. I'm not trying to minimize that. Okay. But for journalists a year later, in the middle of a fucking pandemic where we've seen 800,000 people die, for them to continue focusing on this as though there aren't other things to discuss. How about all of the promises that Biden and Democrats have reneged on? Why aren't they covering that incessantly instead of continuing to hyperfixate on what happened on January 6th? It's very obviously for their own benefit, right? And I think it's unfortunate, but I think that's something we're going to deal with going forward, right? We're going to hear all about insurrection and what if they were successful, even though you guys what if they got into the Senate chamber? What if listen, again, I don't mean to minimize the harm that could have come to members of Congress. It just takes one person to start the mob mentality off. I get it. I'm not trying to minimize that. But you guys, are people under the impression that they somehow then would have been in charge of the military or somehow, would have taken over Congress? What are they going to hold a session if they got into the Senate chamber? Are they going to vote on something? Are they going to enact a new law? I mean, what did people think was going to happen here, right? And again, I don't mean to minimize the potential for just out and out violence. That's horrific. It was probably terrifying for a lot of people. I don't mean to minimize that. But the idea that we were somehow vulnerable as a country to an insurrection or a new civil war or something. I mean, people are just taking this to such a ridiculous conclusion in order to make a bigger deal out of it than it is to exploit it for viewership and ratings, right? So I wanted to briefly touch on that because it felt like that was all that got any attention in the mainstream media. I'm sure a number of you guys saw the Democrats beclowning themselves, lining up to shake hands with Dick fucking Cheney, and then slamming Republicans for not standing up for the cops at the Capitol. And it's just, they've totally fallen off their rocker on this stuff. And it reminds me of Ellen sitting in a suite watching a football game with George W. Bush, or Michelle Obama saying that George W. Bush is one of her best friends. They find the need to rehabilitate the most monstrous characters of modern history, all in the name of saying Trump bad, January 6th bad. And it's the most pathetically obvious virtue signal, you guys. Who is sitting up here saying Trump good? Clowns are. That's really about it. So who are they fighting? Who anyway. It was a total embarrassment. It was humiliating. The Democrats once again demonstrating that they stand for absolutely nothing, and all that they're there to do is rhetorically exploit these cultural conflict lines to try to virtue signal to their base and their and when I say their base, I don't mean like progressives like some people do. I literally just mean like partisan Democratic voters. That's they're virtue signaling to like the suburban Democratic voter that they now seem to treat as their base. So I was pretty nauseated by the coverage surrounding January 6th and the extent of the attention it got and how much it hogged the news cycle lately. So I wanted to make sure to just touch on that and explain why I think it is so outrageous and ridiculous. And yet, because cable news channels in particular, but really a lot of these mainstream outlets are losing viewers incredibly fast. I mean, a lot of them, you guys, over the last year, they've seen like a 25 to 35% drop in ratings. Even the New York Times and the Washington Post, they're down in viewership by quite a wide margin. So I think they're Trump in a way saved their business model, which was already on the way down. And they view something like January 6th as this item to exploit to get back to those glory days where they got to just talk about Trump every day. Because that brought in viewership flat out. Cable news during the Obama era, they were all terrified. Like it was pretty clear the charts are all going down. And especially among target demographics, the younger demographics, right? My generation does not watch cable news. We just don't. We have so many better sources. We can go online and watch just about anything. Why would we sit there and watch, fucking CNN or MSNBC? Why would we do it? Why would we torture ourselves like that, right? So I think they saw that coming during the Obama era, and they were sort of just they stumbled upon this short-term answer in Donald Trump. Because he is such a fucking clown that you can exploit him for viewership on both sides, right? And we saw Fox do it in a different way than we saw MSNBC do it. But in the last year and a half or so, both of them have seen their ratings suffer quite a bit because they no longer have that thing to exploit, that conflict that they can put up on the screen and treat it as breaking news every single day, right? The Russiagate nonsense, it brought in viewers for years, and now it just falls flat. Who the fuck cares now? Because Donald Trump's not in office anymore, so they can't even exploit these outrageous conspiracy theories like they were doing for 3 or 4 years anymore. So what do? They grasp on desperately to January 6th and anything like it. And I just thought that was rather pathetic and worth noting. That there's all these things going on in the world, catastrophic climate events going on in the world, in negotiations with Iran, tons of stuff happening in the Middle East, right? We're in the middle of a deadly fucking pandemic. We're going to talk later about stuff happening in New York with the mayor engaging in, basically appointing corrupt people to the police force, appointing his brother to the police force, this kind of thing. There's these major stories out there, right? Chris Cuomo forced to pay back his fucking money, the Maxwell trial, Epstein, Prince Andrew. Like, there are so many things right now going on in the world that are newsworthy. And what does the press do? They go hug onto January 6th and try to desperately grasp onto the last thing that brought them any decent ratings whatsoever. It's sad. It's pathetic. It's why they're going to continue to precipitously fall in their ratings, and their business model is toast. But I did think that was worth mentioning. So I want to talk U.S. foreign policy here a little bit. And there are a couple of things that I saw come out pertaining to foreign policy and how we come to our decisions, and also the results of our actions in the Middle East. So I want to start with a clip on Breaking Points. This is Richard Hanania. I hope I got that name right. He studies and writes about U.S. foreign policy, and this is him explaining how we think of it as being a decision-making process with authoritative people, and it's really just not. It's kind of just this chaotic clusterfuck of individual intentions that compile to make these macro decisions on foreign policy. Richard did a great job breaking this down, so this is a portion of his interview on Breaking Points.
Us now, great friend of the show, Richard Hanania. He is out with a new book, Public Choice Theory and the Illusion of Grand Strategy. Richard's been a great source of this show, particularly during the Afghanistan debacle. There was one story we wanted to get his take on, but also to talk about his book. So let's put that up there on the screen. Who won in Afghanistan? Well, it's private contractors. It turns out netted trillions of dollars while they were over there. Richard, talk to us a little bit about that and tie it to your fantastic book, which thank you very much, by the way, for sending it to us.
Yeah, absolutely. So my book argues, I've been studying international relations sort of as you guys are, as just a consumer of the news, but also academically. And so I've read, pretty much, all the important thinkers in international relations, the theories about what we're supposedly doing overseas. And I think that, I just came to the conclusion that people are basically thinking about the whole thing wrong, whether they think the U.S. Should have a prominent role in world affairs, whether they believe in support this war or that war. I think that the problem is, we think that there's actually somebody in charge, that there is a grand strategy where sort of like wise men are sitting around and sort of determining what the U.S. should be doing about Afghanistan, about Iraq, about the rise of China, about any number of things. And, I don't think that that's actually what's happening. I think Afghanistan is such a good way to sort of introduce people to the rest of what foreign policy is like, because the mistakes and the blunders and the sort of how disastrous it is and the waste and everything else. I mean, it's just so obvious and it's so clear. And it's been like that for 20 years. So yeah, that money in Afghanistan, the war of Afghanistan, just like the war in Iraq, the money runs into the spending runs into the trillions. A lot of it was government contractors, and the government contractors would do everything from build girls schools to supply the U.S. bases, to provide security. And these people got very, very wealthy. I mean, these people are one of the reasons why Washington D.C. has now basically every single one of the wealthiest counties in the country are around Washington D.C.
Yeah, that's right.
This is these people who made money off of Afghanistan, who made money off Iraq. We left Afghanistan, and the same people are in charge as they were when we originally went in. But yeah, I think foreign policy. I mean, I think it demonstrates that foreign policy is working. I mean, you could look at Iraq too. You say, what did we gain out of Iraq? Well, it didn't work. There's no actual tangible benefit you can point to for the American people there. But go look up every single person who was involved in the Iraq War. What are they doing now? They're not in jail. They haven't suffered any financial harm. Wolfowitz went on to lead the World Bank. Some of them are at the Hudson Institute, where people still tell us about what we should do on foreign policy next. So if you understand foreign policy this way, and this is a theme of my book, it's working. It's working the way the system is designed for certain interests, and it's helping those interests, and it's sort of working as designed. While if you think in terms of national interest, you're going to be constantly confused by what we're doing overseas.
Right.
That's so well said. I mean, it seems to me that the people who get richest in Washington are the people who are willing to do the sketchiest stuff. So whether it's like war profiteering or selling yourself to the sketchiest possible foreign governments, those are the people who get really rich in this area. I think we have the book jacket we can put up on the screen. It's called Public Choice Theory and the Illusion of Grand Strategy: How Generals, Weapons Manufacturers, and Foreign Governments Shape American Foreign Policy. So Richard, take us through Afghanistan as a great case example here. I mean, how were these decisions made? How's the decision initially made to go in? How's the decision made to just continue and stay the course and lie to people and continue in this direction that we know has been and ultimately was a complete failure?
Yeah. So, I mean, when we ask the question, how was the decision made, it implies that a decision was made. And really, it basically wasn't. I mean, you don't have to take my word for it. I mean, I go through Iraq and Afghanistan. I have quotes from people who were involved in these decisions, and they themselves will tell you, we never talked about it. What were we going to do in Afghanistan? 9/11, something, it happened. We wanted to go back. We wanted to get revenge. We wanted to bring the people to justice. So they went into Afghanistan, and there was just no planning about what would happen after. They basically ended up drawing a constitution. It was done by people like the State Department and UN types who have these, standard idea of what makes a good government. So they just sort of implemented that on Afghanistan. We worked with the warlords, and then the U.S. troops were just basically walking around around and not doing much. And there wasn't actually that violent for the first few years. Bush administration attention switched over to Iraq, and then Iraq is an entire different story. But yeah, this is basically what happened. And then Obama comes in, a decade later after this sort of drift, and he sort of is skeptical of the mission. The generals, they go and they basically do a full-on PR campaign. They're teaming up with Congress and saying, this is going to be a big disaster for, Obama doesn't double down, this is going to be a disaster for the country. There's going to be the terrorist threat's going to go up, and they're leaking things to the Washington Post and other papers. And Obama decides to stay. Trump, it's the exact same story. I mean, that's what's so fascinating. He comes in and
Right.
he's skeptical, and they basically just bully him and beat him down until he decides to continue on. And they try to do the same thing with Biden. And you can see how the justification changes throughout the whole process. So first it was terrorism. Then you had the Bush doctrine. It became sort of folded in with Iraq. With the Bush doctrine, the idea that you needed to democratize the world, or at least the Muslim countries, that started because they couldn't find the WMDs. Nobody talked about this before. There was no WMD. So Bush sort of needed a reason for Iraq to still make sense. Afghanistan sort of got caught up in that. And then in 2020, we're talking about women's rights and China and whatever. They're just throwing it whatever they can against the wall and seeing whatever sticks. So a lot of stuff works like this. Basically, you have these interests, they want a policy, and they're reverse engineering whatever arguments they want to make around the policy. And the policy is always keep doing what we're doing. If we have a commitment to a country, or we're in a certain region of the world, we have to stay. One of the things I point out in my book, and this is very interesting, that if you look at the countries that have the most U.S. troops right now, they're the same countries that had the most U.S. troops stationed there in 1950. So it's Germany, Italy, Japan, South Korea. So the U.S. is still occupying the Axis powers and basically fighting the Korean War, right? Yeah. And I think 50, 60 years from now, we could still be doing the exact same thing, and everyone will have a reason why we need to be in Germany, Italy, Japan. I mean, we have to think, when Crystal said, the people willing to do sketchy things, I think they're people who, I think it selects for that, yes, but also for people who are able to convince themselves, what they need to believe. So I think a lot of these foreign policy people are sincere, but it's very easy to predict what their views are going to be, because all you have to do is think, well, whatever the U.S. is doing right now has to be kept being done, and you're usually going to be correct. You're usually going to be able to predict their views on at any particular issue.
Well, that's actually what I wanted to follow up with. Is it just as simple as follow the money? Or is it follow the money and the power and the ideology? Like, what are the interests actually at stake here?
I think we really underplay the money, because I don't think money is everything. I think power and the ideology is very important. But look, the money is absolutely huge. So when you have basically every 3- and 4-star general now, when retiring, going to work for a defense contractor, it's 100% or close to it in the last decade and a half. Basically, anytime you see a general, he's going to and he's near the end of his career, he's going to be working for a weapons manufacturer or some kind of government contractor soon. So in any other industry, we sort of look at this and we get suspicious. There was a post story I was involved in where they basically talked about this, that these people are, they're on boards of, Boeing or whatever corporation, and they're not being introduced they're not being introduced by people telling them this is actually a corporate representative. Nikki Haley, when she was on Boeing, I think she left the board, but when she was there, they'd say Nikki Haley's former UN ambassador. They wouldn't say Nikki Haley, current board member of Boeing. So the money is important, and the ideology works with it, because I think what the money does is it follows the people with the correct ideology. So it's both. So I think someone like John Bolton. It's funny when you read John Bolton's memoir. He's talking about like how busy he is because all these corporate consultants want him, and like he's going to be he's on the phone and having to juggle like all these commitments just because he's like such a hit in business. I think John Bolton, I think he believes. I think he believes in something. He seems to love war more than even his self-interest would recommend. But it's people like that who are going to rise to the top because they have the right ideology to be supported with the people with the resources and power. So you can't say really it's either or. I think you need both to make for American foreign policy.
So I thought that was a really fantastic breakdown, and the way he kind of described at the end there, I think we tend to think of corruption as working in only one direction. And what I mean is we think of it as this very direct quid pro quo. You pay me, I do X, Y, or Z for you, right? It really is often a lot more discreet than that. And I'll use the example of like how I think it works in media. I don't think that the president of MSNBC or CNN has to explicitly go to the personalities at their network and express the kind of coverage that they want done. I don't think it has to happen that explicitly. I think their hiring practices are determined by what kind of coverage they want, right? So we covered like Chris Cillizza last week in his humiliating breakdown of the New York Times potential 2024 Democratic nominee for president candidates, right? I don't think Cillizza has ever had to be told in his life that he needs to dumb down his coverage or be more friendly to the powers that be. I think he still has his job because that's what he does. So you see how it can go both ways. And I think that's what Richard was describing there in the military-industrial complex. The people who rise to power in the American foreign policy establishment are those who already have the desired opinions. So they've come through the institutions that are there to instill these opinions on them, right? To sort of just dictate how these people view the world. And then once they have those opinions, they get the job. So it never really even has to be as explicit as the quid pro quo that we tend to think about, right? But it still has that same financial, self-interested incentive structure that drives the entire thing. So he mentions Bolton there at the end, right? John Bolton, I think, very much believes all of the horrendous nonsense that he espouses. And that is exactly why he's constantly on cable news. And that's why every administration brings him in to advise. And you know, so I think we have to sort of, I think a lot of corruption happens in more nuanced ways than how we sort of visualize it. And I think Richard broke it down very well there. And as it pertains to you know, that he kind of mentions there's not really a decision-making process in the way that we think that there is, right? I think we all kind of think of it as like there's like 10 people in a room who are the powers that be that sit around and make these decisions well in advance and plan this all out in a big picture scheme sort of way. And I think what he's saying is, no, what it really is all of these self-interested people who are engaging in that fashion. And then the result that you get is just this sort of, it's almost like a democracy of self-interest. It's like what outcome is best for most of the people who have say. And that's the outcome that you get, right? So, and he mentioned also like these generals that do the revolving door thing. They're immediately, you guys, you can be a general in the United States military and be wrong about everything your entire career for decades. You can talk about strategies that turn out to miserably fail. You can, you know, support wars that are disasters and catastrophes and lead to massive civilian death. And you will still be paraded up there on the mainstream outlets as though you are knowledgeable and as though you have expertise and as though your opinion is worth listening to. Very similar. I was talking last week about political commentary. You can be wrong your whole career and still be treated like an expert. That happens in foreign policy too. Okay. And he gave the great example of Nikki Haley while she's on the board of Boeing. She's not introduced that way, you guys. Right? You never see him on cable news. I'm going back a little bit, but Bernie's ex-campaign chair was on, I think it was MSNBC, and called out Heidi Heitkamp for spewing a bunch of establishment-friendly nonsense while she was taking money from corporations and banks and whoever the fuck else she takes money from. He calls her out for that on cable news. And the host, whose job it was, by the way, to initially mention that Heidi Heitkamp is taking money from these sources, if they want to be objective at all, the host pushes back and says, well, we're not questioning Heidi Heitkamp's integrity, are we? I know we're not doing that. So, like, they play defense for the very corruption that they're supposed to call out. So all of these dynamics, I think, are at play on you know, both in the media infrastructure and in the foreign policy infrastructure. And there's some overlap there, too, because they have to manufacture consent for these wars. Right. We wouldn't have been in Iraq, you guys, if the entire media did not kick into gear to support us going into Iraq. MSNBC famously fired some of their most popular characters. Or personalities rather, because they refused. Ed Schultz was fired by MSNBC because he refused to support the Iraq war. There were a couple of others too. Chris Hedges fired by MSNBC because he refused to support the Iraq war. Tom Hartman. Okay, so the media kicked into full gear to support this war. And you know, I mean, Cenk Uygur, I got all the issues in the world with TYT, you guys, but there's this story that I don't know how many of you have heard this, that Cenk tells about when he was at MSNBC. And I wish I could remember the guy's name. The president, longtime president, no longer, recently stepped down. Someone put it in the chat, the ex-president of MSNBC until maybe about a year ago, 6 months ago. He basically told Cenk to water his coverage down on Iraq and Afghanistan, our foreign policy. And Cenk essentially said no, and a couple weeks later he was let go. So Cenk tells this story to describe how explicit it can be when you actually, you know, step out of line. My point is, I think so few actually step out of line that explicit conversation is hardly ever necessary, right? And I think that applies to both of these fields. So anyway, a great job there from Richard breaking down you know, how the incentives actually interact with each other to formulate the decisions that are made on U.S. foreign policy, and how catastrophic that was in Iraq and Afghanistan. And I just want to encourage my audience to pay attention to that stuff. If you see somebody who is treated like an expert, who, you know, supported these wars and you know, stood on the front line fighting for us to stay involved in these areas, make sure to take that with a strong grain of salt and take into account the financial incentives and the self-interested incentives that go into all of the commentary and decision making pertaining to foreign policy, right? I also have an article here I wanted to share with you guys that is in Jacobin, and it's about how, you know, this is, it should seem really obvious, but how we've created more terrorists with the war on terror. We purport to be there to try to fight terrorism and extremism, and instead we end up creating a lot more terrorists in doing so. And just to briefly explain this dynamic, groups over there, like they literally use videos of U.S. officials in their recruitment process. So when you have a U.S. Secretary of State or U.S. Secretary of Defense or U.S. Vice President or a high-ranking senator or what have you, essentially supporting our continued unnecessary offensive wars all over the world, that gets then used to recruit new members to these extremist groups. So we're actually creating jihadists and working with jihadists while we claim that our job is to combat terror and fight against terror. So it's, you know, regardless of the position that you want to take on the Middle East in general, our role has been to do the exact opposite of what we claim. And that's kind of the point, right? I'm not fucking pro-jihadist, you guys. There are a lot of horrendous groups out there, and the theocratic, ultra-conservative ideology that these groups grasp onto is detrimental and horrible. It's you know, I'm not pro-fucking jihadist. I'm also not pro the United States enhancing that. I'm not in support of my government going out there and helping jihadists. Okay, so that's the point of this piece here. This is in Jacobin by Nick Terse. The war on terror has been very successful at creating new terrorists. The supposed point of the war on terror was to stop terrorism. Instead, the war on terror has created many, many more terrorists. It began more than 2 decades ago. On September 20th, 2001, President George W. Bush declared a war on terror and told the joint session of Congress and the American people that the course of this conflict is not known, yet its outcome is certain. If he meant a 20-year slide to defeat in Afghanistan, a proliferation of militant groups across the greater Middle East and Africa, and a never-ending world-spanning war that at a minimum has killed about 300 times the number of people murdered in America on 9/11. That really is minimum, you guys. That's the most conservative estimate. Then give him credit. He was absolutely right. Days earlier, Congress had authorized Bush to use all necessary and appropriate force against those nations, organizations, or persons he determined planned, authorized, committed, or aided the terrorist attacks that occurred on September 11th, 2001, or harbored such organizations or persons. That's a very vague authorization, you might notice. By then, it was already evident, as Bush said in his address, that al-Qaeda was responsible for the attacks. But it was equally clear that he had no intention of conducting a limited campaign. Quote, "Our war on terror begins with al-Qaeda, but it does not end there," he announced. "It will not end until every terrorist group of global reach has been found, stopped, and defeated." This was an important piece because it allowed us to continue that war well beyond what its initial intentions were. Congress had already assented to whatever the president saw fit to do. It had voted 420-1 in the House and 98-0 in the Senate to grant an authorization for use of military force that would give him and presidents to come essentially a free hand to make war around the world. Quote, I believe that it's broad enough for the president to have the authority to do all that he needs to do to deal with this terrorist attack and threat, Senate Minority Leader Trent Lott said at the time. I also think that it is tight enough that the constitutional requirements and limitations are protected. Boy, was Senator Lott ever wrong about that one. The AUMF would, however, quickly become a blank check for boundless war. In the 2 decades since, the 2001 authorization for use of military force has been formally invoked to justify counterterrorism operations, including ground combat, airstrikes, detention, and the support of partner militaries in 22 countries, according to a new report by Stephanie Saville of Brown University's Costs of War Project. During that same time, the number of terrorist groups threatening Americans and American interests has, according to the U.S. State Department, more than doubled. That, again, you guys, very conservative estimate, especially pertaining to the number of members of these groups. Under that AUMF, U.S. troops have conducted missions across 4 continents. The countries in question include some of little surprise, like Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria, and a few unexpected nations, like Georgia and Kosovo. Quote, in many cases, the executive branch inadequately described the full scope of U.S. actions, writes Saville, noting the regular invocation of vague language, pretzeled logic, and weak explanations. In other cases, the executive branch reported on support for CT operations, but did not acknowledge that troops were or could be involved in hostilities with militants. So the point here is that even according to the U.S. State Department, we have over doubled the size and number of groups that we are purporting to fight in the Middle East. It has been a catastrophic failure by any metric that you want to use. And again, I just want to be clear, you guys, there's this false dichotomy that I think often applies to foreign policy where you look at it in a vacuum and pick a good guy and a bad guy. And more often than not, by a wide margin, in fact, the vast majority of the time that we're talking about foreign policy conflicts, every actor involved is a bad one. Vast majority of the time, this included, okay? ISIS, bad actors. Al-Qaeda, bad actors. United States, also very bad actors. Okay. And I just really want to drive that point home, that when we analyze these things, we need to not engage in the kind of nationalism that that the media and pop culture try to impress upon us. And it's also it's very much worth pointing out, I think the most effective argument, we can make arguments about the military industrial complex. We can point out all the civilian death and all of this stuff. And those are all very strong arguments to me. To me, those are all enough to very clearly, find or whatever that our decisions have been bad. The military industrial complex and the civilian death alone amount to enough evidence that we were wrong here. But I think the most effective arguments against those who still support these wars are to point out that we've done the opposite of what we said we were doing. So to those who would sit there and say civilian death is horrible, but it's collateral and it's unfortunate, but it's necessary. Okay, well, how about the fact that we did the exact opposite of what we said we were going to go over there to do? So what were those deaths for? So that we could double the strength and authority and leverage that Al-Qaeda has? Like, we leave Afghanistan 20 years later and the same fucking people are in charge as when we got there. So you want to, if you want to try to minimize the extent of the damage that we lefties like to talk about a lot, you also have to explain why it is that you support an operation that had the opposite of the quote unquote intended effect. So U.S. foreign policy in a nutshell is a contradiction. It's a paradox. It's hypocritical. It's entirely dishonest. You guys, we support at any given, over the last couple of decades, at any given time, we've supported 75 to 85% of the world's dictatorships, whether financially or through being allies or, in any other way, rhetorically, whatever it might be. 75 to 85% of the dictatorships we support. And then we turn around and we say, oh, well, our foreign policy is all about freedom and democracy and this and that, right? Just look at Saudi Arabia. Just look at Saudi Arabia. We claim we're all about freedom and democracy. We support one of the most authoritarian, theocratic states in the world. You know what Saudi Arabia is, you guys? That's ISIS that made it as a country. That's what Saudi Arabia is. And we support them and participate in their genocide in Yemen. We and 11 other countries or whatever it is, the coalition. So you just look at Saudi Arabia and you can see the extent of the hypocrisy, the rank hypocrisy that just essentially makes up our foreign policy. So I wanted to make sure to touch on that because I thought those two pieces, the Jacobin piece and Richard's interview were fantastic. I encourage my audience to go follow Richard's work as well. He wrote a whole book on this stuff. So, go follow Richard Hanania and inform yourself on these issues. So, and another, sort of tangentially related story here that's on foreign policy. It's about Iran. Again, I want to make sure to set the stage here properly. Both bad guys. Not a fan of the Iranian government, you guys. Not a fan of an ultra-conservative, theocratic, authoritarian government. Not a fan, okay? Also not a fan of how the United States has handled the, conflict with Iran, the ongoing, perpetual conflict with Iran going back decades and decades and decades. So this is about how Trump murdered one of Iran's top generals. And Iran is now calling for Trump and Pompeo to face consequences for that. This is in the Hill. Iran calls for Trump, Pompeo to face trial for Soleimani assassination. And just for comparison, you guys, imagine what would happen if Iran decided to assassinate one of our top generals. Soleimani was even almost above generals. He was such an important figure in the Iranian military. It would almost be like a Secretary of Defense or something being assassinated. Imagine how the United States would respond if Iran did that. Just imagine. We would be at war in 2 seconds flat. There would be nukes flying to Iran the moment the president heard the news. I mean, it wouldn't even be we think we have this privilege to engage in acts of war. And yet if other countries were to do the same, we would hit them with everything that we fucking have. It's just rank hypocrisy. Iranian President Ibrahim Raisi is calling for former President Trump and former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo to face trial for the assassination of General Qasem Soleimani, who was killed in January 2020 drone strike ordered by Trump. Raisi, in a speech on Monday, said Trump and Pompeo should be tried in a fair court for the assassination of Soleimani. He called Trump an aggressor, murderer, and the main culprit. If Trump and Pompeo are not tried in a fair court for the criminal act of assassinating General Soleimani, Muslims will take our martyrs' revenge, Raisi said. Now, there you get the extreme response that Raisi, by the way, relatively new president in Iran, hard-line conservative. They swung to the right this last election cycle. So Raisi is a maniac. The aggressor, murderer, and main culprit, and then President of the United States, must be tried and judged under the Islamic law of retribution, and God's ruling must be carried out against him. So as you can see, like I said right off the bat, you guys, no good guys here, okay? We engaged in an active war, knowing full well that Iran would not do anything about it because we can crush them like a little bug. So we take advantage of that in order to bully the rest of the world, and that's horrendous and egregious. And yes, Trump and Pompeo, by the way, should be at the Hague for war crimes. So Raisi is not wrong in what he's saying here. He's just wrong about the whole, he should be tried under Islamic law. I mean, I'm sorry. It's just fucking utterly ridiculous. Soleimani was killed near Baghdad's airport on January 3rd, 2020 in a drone strike that Trump ordered. Quote, "We took action last night to stop a war. We did not take action to start a war," Trump said in a statement. Can we just think about that for a second? I'll again ask you to engage in the thought experiment. What if Iran assassinated one of our top generals, and then when we went to retaliate, they said, wait, no, hold up. We didn't do that to start a war. We did it to prevent a war. So call off the forces. We all would laugh at that, wouldn't we? And the whole world would laugh at that, wouldn't they? As they're laughing at Trump and Pompeo for this outrageous statement. You engage in an act of war and then say it's to prevent a war. I mean, it's like the most Orwellian thing. War is peace, right? The Pentagon at the time said it carried out the mission because Soleimani was actively developing plans to attack American diplomats and service members in Iraq and throughout the region, and was responsible for the deaths of hundreds of Americans and coalition service members and the wounding of thousands more. Let's also evaluate that for a moment, you guys. We're claiming self-defense as an occupying force. They type that out as though it's perfectly rational and reasonable without reading it back and going, hang on, wait a minute. U.S. troops where? In Iraq. Claiming what? Self-defense. While they are what? An occupying force. Paradoxical, hypocritical, nonsensical. Okay, from the start. And this is also not accurate, quite frankly. Soleimani was fighting ISIS, you guys. Again, no fan of the Iranian government, not here to simp for the Iranian government. But Soleimani, his task was fighting ISIS. So what did the United States do by assassinating Soleimani? What did we do? We sided with the jihadists, which we've done all too often, okay? That's what we did. And then we turned around and tried to say, we're in Iraq to fight the jihadists, who we're now supporting by assassinating Soleimani, and we're also going to claim self-defense while we're an occupying... I mean, do you guys see how ridiculous this all gets very quickly? There's no, and it's about what Richard was talking about. There's no sensible decision-making process when it comes to the United States foreign policy. Pompeo also defended the strike, saying, quote, "We are definitely safer today." You took out someone fighting ISIS who you claim you're there to fight, and then you say we're safer because we took out this guy who's also fighting the same enemy that we say we're in the region to fight. You guys see how, you know, that meme where the woman is looking all confused and it's just a whole bunch of numbers and question marks and shit? That's what this is. That is U.S. foreign policy. So shame on Trump and Pompeo, and shame on Raisi for going all like, you should be tried in an Islamic court. I mean, this is an insane story, an unhinged story from all sides. United States wrong on Iranian policy for decades. We have long been the aggressor and the first to break deals, and we've done numerous coups in Iran and all this, right? So we deserve all of the pushback we get. And Trump and Pompeo engaging in an active war and then asserting that they did so to stop a war is one of the most ridiculous things that I have ever heard. So unfortunate situation in Iran, you guys, that by the way, one of the reasons you get those extremists in Iran, one of the reasons, I'm not saying the only reason, I'm no expert on domestic policy in Iran, okay? But one of the reasons that and this is Dr. Trita Parsi from the oh, Jesus Christ, I'm blanking on the name now. He's with Johns Hopkins and blanking on the name of his institute. He does foreign policy. Anyhow, oh, that's like on the tip of my tongue. That's gonna drive me fucking crazy. Someone put it in the fucking chat, please. Anyway, he talked about how in Iran those elections in part went the way that they did because the United States broke our word so many times. So the moderates in Iran who had worked with the Obama administration to sign the nuclear deal were essentially like, we made a fool out of them for trusting us. The Quincy Institute, thank you. If Quincy Institute, if anyone was wondering. So we essentially we make fools out of the people who were willing to work with us and sign a deal with us. Well, how do you think that's going to affect Iranian politics? Of course, then the hardline conservative theocratic maniacs can come in and say, you have no business trusting them at all. And they're going to look smart. They were down on the deal from the start, you guys, and they were accusing the moderates of being fools and being naive. And what did the U.S. do? We went and proved the extremists correct. So this again, it's like a self-fulfilling. We have extremists in Iran now unwilling to sign another deal, in part because we violated our end of the deal, which made the moderates look ridiculous. So, we're wrong on virtually every side of this, and it's just an all around terrible situation in Iran right now. And the United States, the effect that we have had on that country and on that region is beyond egregious. And to go back to that Jacobin article, we are fostering extremism. We are creating extremism. We're not combating it. We're not fighting it. Nothing of the sort. So Wanted to make sure that everybody knows those are the talking points to fire back at your imperialist, the imperialists in your life. Make sure they understand we are creating more terrorists and creating more extremism than we are combating. So I also wanted to talk briefly here about the 30-hour backup on I-95. This is an NPR. Officials finally clear up crashes that kept drivers in freezing temperatures on I-95. Drivers along a 50-mile stretch of Interstate 95 in Virginia, south of the nation's capital, are no longer trapped in freezing temperatures after heavy snowfall contributed to spinouts and crashes. Quote, I-95 is open after being closed for emergency response for most of the day, Virginia's Department of Transportation announced in a tweet just after 9:30 Eastern on Tuesday, more than 24 hours after the traffic nightmare began. Quote, all disabled vehicles have been removed from the interstate, the state DOT continued. Hundreds of drivers became stranded in standstill traffic during Monday's rush hour, and some remain stuck for 16 hours or more, some even 30. That's actually a low number they put in this article. State police said several tractor trailers jackknifed on the slippery interstate, making the road impassable and causing a massive backup of commuters. Traffic was still not back to normal by early afternoon on Tuesday, and some people were still stranded. Governor Ralph Northam sent an emergency alert to drivers saying supplies and help were on the way. Okay. Northam is exactly why I wanted to cover this. Northam came out and effectively said, not our fault. We warned you not to be on the road. So he turned around and blamed the drivers for being on the road when this all went down. Guys, this was a situation where people could have easily died. I don't know that people really realize the extent of this situation. I mean, I'm no fan of the dude, but apparently Senator Tim Kaine was stuck in this traffic. He said he was in this place where he didn't know how long this was going to last. So he's trying to conserve his gas and also stay warm. So he'd turn his car on for 5 or 10 minutes to heat it up a little bit, then turn it off and fall asleep, wake up 20 or 30 minutes later because it's fucking freezing cold, and turn his car on for 5 or 10 more, right? I mean, imagine every time you're doing that, a couple times an hour, you're sitting there going, how much gas do I have left, right? Imagine if you were on the road on some long road trip and your gas light comes on right before you hit that traffic. And now you got a day plus to sit in your car and try to stay warm, okay? You got traffic back, you got pets and kids, no bathrooms, no food, no, like this was a disastrous emergency situation, the type of situation where people very much have died in the past. And Northam's response is, yeah, it's the driver's fault. We warned you. You shouldn't have been on the road. So simultaneously, these elite assholes want to tell you, you need to go to work. You know, don't let COVID stop you from going to work. Return to work. And at the same time, they want to say, we warned you not to be on the road. By the way, of all locations, the National Guard could easily have been dispersed. This is right by the Capitol. It's in Virginia. Did Northam utilize the National Guard? No, he didn't. There was one guy who posted from this backup that he had been there for like a day and seen one cop, and that it had been hours and hours and hours since he'd seen a cop. The authorities did nothing about this, nothing. So that was the reason that I wanted to cover it. It seems like in every mode of crisis, the response that we get is either inadequate or nothing at all. We look at COVID right now. We look at climate crisis. You know, we look at any time there's a financial crash. The response that we get from those who are tasked with dealing with these situations is always inadequate or nothing at all. And then it's to point the finger and blame the powerless among us, the victims of these crises. It's your fault, right? Right? An increase in food prices is your fault for taking a $1,200 check. You're stuck on the road. That's your fault. Don't want a climate crisis? Why are you driving a car? Right? It has to be made about the powerless. We are the ones to blame for all these crises that they allow to happen to us. So I'm very grateful that this crash is, or this backup rather, is cleared up. For those that don't know, I-95 is like one of the most traveled stretches of road on the East Coast. That very stretch. So just terrifying. Imagine being in that situation where you don't have information, you don't know when you're going to get out. You're sitting there going, are we going to be here 2 or 3 more days? What are we going to eat? Right? All that kind of stuff. I did see one anecdotal story that was kind of heartwarming. There was a truck that got stuck in this mess that was a bread delivery truck. Like it was stocked full of bread, right? So a couple sitting behind this truck noticed that, called the company, and apparently someone at the company ordered the driver to start handing out bread. So heartwarming anecdotal example of some good happening, but again, that's kind of the exception that proves the rule in terms of how companies tend to behave about this stuff. But I did think that was a cool story. It also kind of, it expresses the desperation, you guys. That's not the kind of thing that happens if everything's fine. If we just need a couple more hours and we'll have it cleared up, you can bet that company's not distributing bread to drivers, right? So I just wanted to make sure everybody understood the extent of what this could have turned into, and how lacking the response from authorities were. And then for Northam to turn around and just blame the people stuck in traffic. What the fuck, man? What the fuck? What is wrong with you? You're the one with the authority to deal with this situation. And instead you left people in the freezing cold for 30 hours and then wagged your finger at them. Fuck you. Shame on you. That's just outrageous. So I did want to make sure to note on that was a big story here this last week. So at this point, guys, I want to show you an interview I did earlier this week. This is with a friend of the show, regular Vinay Orekondy. He is an attorney and activist. He's got experience in labor law, so we talked a little bit about the labor movement and how 2021 saw some success. So a little bit of leverage being shifted back to workers. We also talked about Vinay has been interested in exploring what creates political identity. And he had a very interesting comparison between right-wing political identity and a very popular TV show. So that was an interesting discussion. This is a long interview, and I apologize for my audio quality, you guys. I was sitting here on my set and apparently somehow did not set it to use my microphone. So you're hearing me through my laptop. It's not the very greatest audio quality in the world. I do apologize for that. But this was a fantastic discussion, as always, with Vinay. So enjoy, and we'll come back and finish the show out. Well, I'm happy to welcome back to the show, friend of the show, Vinay Orekondy. Vinay is an attorney and activist in the progressive movement. We met on the Bernie campaign in 2020 in New Hampshire. Vinay, thank you so much for being here, as always.
Thanks so much for having me.
So I wanted to talk a little bit about, you've been involved in the labor movement, both here and in Australia. I wanted to show you a clip here from More Perfect Union, who I use quite regularly for the audience. If you don't follow them, they're fantastic. Follow More Perfect Union on Twitter. This is just talking about the year in the labor movement and how workers seem to have, gathered at least a modicum of leverage that they didn't previously have. So we'll watch this video, and then I just wanted to get your thoughts on that broadly.
Sure.
These unprecedented times.
It's difficult times.
To all of our Amazon retail heroes.
The unsung heroes.
We want to say thank you.
Thank
We
you.
want to thank you.
The community stepped up and treated us like heroes. But management, they like to call us heroes, but they definitely don't treat us like such.
We feed all these families, but I can't feed mine.
Forced overtime causes divorces. It causes people to kill themselves that used to work here.
You are a number.
I'm hoping for change. I'm hoping for time with our children. I'm hoping for some more money.
During the pandemic, the stores were making a lot of money.
That success was built on us risking our lives every day.
I want to thank every Amazon employee because you guys paid for all this.
It is a sweatshop in there. They treat them like a gigabyte in a system. Even robots break down sometimes.
We are here to stand up for the humanity of the Amazon worker and the humanity of workers across this country. This is just the beginning.
We're done giving up concession by concession. We're done being bullied by a company that makes millions and millions.
John Deere makes $6 billion a year. Well, guess what? My dad may have carried this in 1986. We're back. We're union strong. We've got the community behind us.
A wave of workers' strikes sweeping across America.
Picket lines popping up nationwide.
Right now, 800 nurses are on strike in Worcester.
In Alabama, over 1,000 mine workers are on strike.
And they gonna give us a good contract. We ain't gonna take no bullshit.
I'm so proud to be here today. It might be a little different for a Secretary of Labor coming out and staying on a picket line. They're calling it Strike-tober.
Strike's giving. We want the better pay pension for everybody. It's not for only one group.
I mean, we're looking out for the guys who come next.
Attention Walmart shoppers and associates. My name is Beth from Electronics. I've been working at Walmart for almost 5 years, and I can say that everyone here is overworked and underpaid. This job, I quit.
People are quitting their jobs in droves in what's been dubbed the Great Resignation.
And we all know what happened in Alabama. They sparked a fuse.
We're gonna bring the fight to Bezos again this year, Jeff. You're gonna negotiate with us soon enough.
Massive win for those John Deere employees. They waited it out.
New hope tonight for New York City's struggling taxi drivers. Many have been on a 2-week hunger strike.
The first company-owned Starbucks to unionize.
For the first time in a long while, the balance of power is shifting away from big businesses.
We've been asked about how long we're willing to fight, and at the end of the day, it's going to be one day longer than they are.
So that just sends a shiver up my spine. I love seeing that shit. I'm always talking about pessimistic stuff, and that video was inspiring to me. I was just hoping I could get your thoughts on what you've seen here this last year or so.
Yeah, it's one, that's awesome. That's it's really, really good to see that happening. And I think for me, it's two things that I immediately come to mind. One is that it's part of a much larger trend. And so for me, it's clear to me why this is happening, because it's part of a larger trend. And second is that it's clearly just the beginning. And I say that not as just trying to be optimistic or, get people like, it's logically there's like where that trend that I spoke about, the first thing that that larger trend, where that ends, this literally can only just be at the beginning, right? So I'll explain what I mean by all this. So I think the larger trend that's going on is that it feels like people have sort of become awake to massive power imbalances, and there's no logical reason for them, right? And I think this is the trend of our time, really. And it's happening across the political spectrum. Is people are noticing that there's no particular reason why huge power imbalances exist, right? It's not like the people at the top are particularly brilliant or are leaders or anything like that. It's just some sort of historical remnant. So I think that everyone in their own way, like all sides of politics in their own way, are trying to tear down that power imbalance, right? Some fights are older than others. Like obviously, the unions fight has been going on since like the Industrial Revolution, right? Whereas, on the right, their fight against the political system is fairly recent. And, I obviously, the theme of our time will be, well, how much of the system can you tear down? What's the right way to attack the system? Where in the system do you attack? But I think like clearly there is movement across the spectrum towards saying, well, we've woken up really, I think almost generationally, to this idea that say, well, why do those people have more power than us? Like, why do they have control of our lives? There's no reason for it, right? And I think what we're now moving into an era is saying, well, let's uphold it if there is a reason for it, or let's tear it down if there's no reason for it, right? And I think that, because it's the same trend, whether like, okay, on the right, obviously there's a lot of attack on scientists because we hold scientists in veneration. And I'm of the belief that there's a reason we hold scientists in veneration, right? Because expertise is something that's earned, right? But you look at something like the structures of capitalism, right? You look at management and is it, and ownership, right? Ownership of companies. It's like, is there a reason? Have they earned that right to control our lives? No, they haven't. They haven't. Maybe, Maybe someone got some startup money. Maybe their parents gave them some money. You know what I mean? Like, it's historical remnants with so much of capitalism, right? And so what I think we are moving to, so that leads to the second question about this being the only beginning. Like, if you think that there's no, like, if the logical conclusion of all this is that there's no reason why, like, after we examine it and, you know, and have those discussions with each other and say, well, there's no logical reason why these people have more power than us, and we rip down that power, then it's more than a matter of just negotiating better conditions. Like, that's literally just the first step, right? The continued steps are going all the way until power is equalized, right? And I've said on the show before, I firmly believe that the end point of all this is a worker co-op driven economy, right? And that's, and you know, in worker co-ops, it's and like that's the thing about worker co-ops. Like, whenever I brought them up and people say, oh, you know, everyone's going to be paid the same or whatever, and it disincentivizes you know, hard work, and you know, they're often the sort of traditional arguments you hear against any kind of socialism. Well, no, actually, in a worker co-op, it's just empowering the collective to make decisions, right? And they may choose, might say, hang on, this is a really rare skill set. Let's pay these people more, right? Because we want to attract them from, instead of that other company, right? They can, there's a lot of decisions that management just makes or owners just make because of they got there somehow, right? There's no reason why a group can't make those same decisions if it concerns this collective survival, right? You give the people the power, the knowledge, the skills to do it, right? And then they essentially, you're turning them into their own bosses, right? And yeah, there's no reason, like if a company is going to go down, like let's say you've got a worker co-op and they're, you know, they need a particular set of skills, right? There's no reason why the company won't survive if they don't have that, and it's a rare skill set. There's no reason why they can't choose to pay someone more, right, to do that. And there's no reason why they can't elect their management if their management is effective, right? And that management can be empowered to hire and fire and run performance management and do all the stuff that kind of makes sense for a company to do, right? Like, it's not like we're, you know, entirely throwing out the system in that sense, right? There are things that you want to retain. You want to retain knowledge and things that have been gained. But there's no reason why you can't put the overarching power in the people who do the work of the organization, and in everyone, right? If you believe everyone has a part to play, then that's why, right? The concept of an individual or a group of individuals from the outside owning an organization just doesn't make sense for the 21st century anymore. Like, a group is like, they have no relationship with the company. It doesn't make sense anymore.
And what do you think is causing people to question this now? Do you think that we had previously thrown enough crumbs to workers that there wasn't so much questioning the deference to authority? Like, do you think that the breaking down of the meritocratic rhetoric, if you will, is a new phenomenon? Do you think that follows with neoliberalism? Like, do you think what mechanisms do you think are at play causing workers to respond differently to that messaging?
Sure. Okay. So I think that, as I said, I believe it's part of the larger trend. So I think a couple of things have happened. I can give you some very normal answers to some very like out there answers, and I think they're all part of the picture. So the most normal answers obviously is that, you know, wealth inequality has increased significantly since the 80s, right? And like, it wasn't always this bad, right? And I think that you know, and my understanding is that in the 60s and the 50s and 60s, that corporations actually were sort of more paternal in nature, and they sort of had a thing about, let's look after them. They weren't necessarily good structures. In fact, they were the ones that turned into what they are today, but it wasn't as bad as it is now. And so I think that has shifted, and that was shifted on the back. That shift has occurred on the back of trickle-down economics, which is just proved to be a complete lie, right? Like the opposite of it has occurred, right? It's been trickle up. So the fact that an entire system is built on an obvious lie is one thing. And I think the second is the internet, right? And I think that people have become very knowledgeable of this fact. One of this fact, but two, more generally, the internet has led to another thing, which is the flattening of power relationships. Like, I think for me, the most interesting flattening has been Twitter, right? Where in the past you'd see, celebrity as this like kind of, unapproachable godlike figure, right? Whereas now they're just someone who like makes weird things on, like they make weird posts. They're just like us. You can have dialogue with them, and and unfortunately, I think in many cases it's actually led to people lashing out in bullying celebrities. So I don't think is reasonable either. Like there's no reason to do that. But that's kind of like an expression of the realization that they're not these sort of unapproachable deities, right? And so I think technology has got a big part of it, because everyone suddenly has access to a lot of knowledge, and knowledge was actually one of the biggest factors in keeping power disparities going, right? It was knowledge. And so I think the fact that everyone has access to all knowledge, even if we're not always using it, but the fact that everyone has access to it is bringing down that power disparity. I think the internet has also brought us together, right? So it's created groups. So just collect, it's the age-old thing about collectivizing, right? And like unions, right? Like unions were about how do we bring people together to realize their collective power. The internet has been a tool of that, right? And it hasn't just been in the union space, obviously. It's been in many spaces. I was in Australia. I was, have run a major advertiser boycott not long after the one that was run against Rush Limbaugh. In fact, it was inspired by that, against our own sort of version of Rush Limbaugh. And it's, again, through Facebook, right? Since then, we've seen the Arab Spring happen, right? Where we had like multiple Arab dictatorships that had been around for like 30 years just collapse overnight. And they were all inspired by one another, right? And they were all organized over the internet, right? So I think technology has played a huge, huge role in that flattening of knowledge and the bringing of people together, right? To realize that, to have the intelligence and knowledge to know that these power structures don't have a logical reason to exist, and that collectively we have the power to overthrow them, right? Now, if we want to get more weird, I think that and this actually gets into sort of some modern political theory as well, that a lot of our relationship with reality has changed. And this is a lot of it, and I don't want to say a lot of it has to do with the movie The Matrix, but it can be summarized in that, right? And obviously the right has taken that, and with the whole red pilling thing, but I don't think, for me, I think the movie was actually much more important than just that, because it's but it also kind of for me it signified a postmodernist era. Like it was like the movie has like tons of references to postmodernism the whole way through, and postmodernism is itself premised on the idea of challenging structures of knowledge, right? It goes beyond economic structures, right? It goes to like knowledge structures that keep people in a mental space, right? And we essentially were doing the Matrix on the left since the 70s, right? That's what most of the modern progressive movement is built on, the idea of challenge the nature of your reality, and that's what Jacques Derrida was writing about, saying, right? Structures are kept in place by ideas, right? And then you challenge the source of those ideas, the structure itself on top of that falls apart. So we're in like psychological chains. And the Matrix has sort of normalized that idea, I think. And it's a symbol of what was already entering mainstream discourse, I think, certainly on the left. Now, I think that the whole red pilling thing that's happening, I think it's just the right kind of responding to that and adopting that as their own. And, a lot of the Trump stuff is their kind of version of that. So So I don't think they've kind of like tried to claim it and all that, but the Matrix was actually the result, I think, of that stuff already happening on the left for a very long time.
Well, and it seems to me like a lot of people on the right would question that narrative in any other context other than one that is convenient for them, some anti-vax or some sort of, it seems like when we talk about like critical legal theory or critical race theory or like actually breaking these things down systemically, the conservatives are the first to object, which doesn't seem to fit with that red pilling line of thinking.
Right. And I think so that they are that the general theme, and I think, as I said, I think is unleashed from the 70s onwards, is the idea that ideas can be chains, and they can keep your society frozen. So if you deconstruct, you deconstruct the source of the idea, and liberation can be achieved, right? And I think that's been important. And I funnily enough, I think that it's become a very I'd say that's arguably the foundation of liberalism. Really, is that ideas can be chains, because it's the foundation of a lot of the of modern identity politics. Is that because our particular identity group is oppressed because of the societal ideas that chain. I think, and that's absolutely valid. But it's also, if you think, it's a foundation of kind of modern startup capitalism, which is, we had to just disrupt everything, right? So I think ironically, it's that if we said the right is reclaiming, at least trying to claim some of those ideas. I think that the socialist left is also doing the same thing too. They're reclaiming a lot of those ideas from liberalism, because they're, arguably, we've lived in sort of a liberally dominant era for some time, and so I think that both the right and the left are kind of creating their own versions of challenging that psychological orthodoxy, and that's why new ideas are emerging. So it's almost like the idea of challenging ideas became the dominant way of thinking, and now that in itself has spread to others who wish to challenge that new dominant way of thinking, if that makes sense.
And what sort of constrains that, though? Because that could theoretically apply to almost anything. I mean, what do you think sort of draws the bounds of what people use this logic to break down, and what people accept or sort of don't think of as red pilling?
Right. So I think that there's multiple answers to that question. I think that, and asking that question is actually kind of what underpins politics right now. So I think that what has happened since the 70s is we've become very fractured, right? And that's why the left is very difficult to move around historically, is because we've become very, very fractured, and on the basis of to our respective identities, right? Because that's just how we've been thinking. And I think that what it's done is that it's created the need, the cycle for community, right? Because that's one thing that's been totally destroyed, right, since the 80s, is community and collectivism of any sort. So it's created, there's obviously a deep human need, right? It's one we've had for most of our existence, is community of some sort. So it's interesting that the pushback, both from the left and the right, towards that orthodoxy, is one that's taking the form of community, right? On the right, it's taking the form of sort of religious or national or racial identity, right? On the left, it's taking the form of class identity, right? So it's the rebellion is against individualism and fracturism, right? Fracturing as a collective. So it's as if, so to answer your question, I think that you're talking about it can just endlessly break up. I think that's what actually happened, and now there's been a counter pushback to actually recreate, using the concept of challenging orthodoxy to actually recreate collectivism in different forms.
So do you think, as it pertains to the labor movement, do you think this is actually an area where, and I know some people get into trouble talking about this, the red-brown alliance and all this nonsense, but just in a broad sense, to what degree do you think there is, ground for reconciliation between the groups on labor issues? Do you think that those attitudes towards authority, even though they're coming from maybe a different identity place, might actually kind of line up and have people standing on the picket line next to each other, even though they have very different cultural views or different ideologies?
I'm not sure. And the reason I'm not sure is because I think the right need to decide where they want to go on economics, right? Because and it's not clear where they'll land, right? Because they are, on the one hand, even though he did absolutely nothing about it and was a con man, you had Donald Trump going around the Midwest saying, I'll bring, preaching a sort of mildly anti-globalization on economic things, which was interesting at the very least, and probably won him the 2016 election, right? In fact, he definitely won him the 2016 election. You have people like Ted Cruz claiming somewhat ridiculously, but also interestingly, that the GOP will be a party for workers, which is insane given that he's, takes oil money and all that sort of thing. But on some level, I think he's reading the tea leaves. But at the same time, so you've got these noises that sound like economically left noises, right? And they also hate the new structures of economic power, like big technology, right? So they had their own kind of version of anti-corporateness, right? But at the same time, the right very much subscribes to like old notions of the American dream, where the individual can just go and do their thing and they'll become a billionaire, and everyone can do the same, right? Like, because there's infinite billions apparently, right? So I don't think they've decided where they want to land on that question yet, and I'll be interested to see where they do. I don't know. What are your thoughts? I'll be interested to hear. Like, do you see those two conflicting strands, or?
I think both could be true. I mean, I think there could be some solidarity to be found in specific instances, but I think on the by and large, culture is so dominant right now in terms of our political rhetoric that I just find it to be quite a tall task to get these two groups together in any broad sense. I think on any given picket line, it might happen once in a while. It might, the stars might align in a way, you know what I mean? But it doesn't seem to me like it's going to have any staying power, because we have such, inflammatory culture issues that are sort of the conflict lines of today's rhetoric.
You know what I think it could work is common enemies, common opponents, because
they don't like Bezos, do they?
Nobody likes Jeff Bezos. Okay? Nobody likes him, and which is interesting. So, and I think that if we do talk about like reclaiming local power, if that's kind of the theme of our era, and you could totally see I could see unions like appealing to people across the political aisle in a local township or whatever, and getting support, for like, and because if you're telling one group, let's stick it to that liberal Bezos, if you're telling another, let's reclaim worker power, hey, it's the same goal, right? But it's also, reclaiming local power is actually kind of a right-wing idea in some ways as well, one that they've championed for a long time. And now they're saying that even more against like multinationals, or certain multinationals anyway. So I think that there will be overlapping interests, and I think the union movement will be very smart to jump on those overlapping interests. And I think, and they absolutely should, they will, I think, in certain places. Unlike other countries in the world, like the union movement here is, weirdly, it's because it's not been as powerful as, say, like the Australian union movement, which is firmly associated with one of our two major parties, right? It's firmly associated with our Labour Party. In fact, they even have a vote in the Labour Party as well. Whereas here, it's not technically as aligned. Like obviously unions are left-wing entities, right? But they're not as firmly aligned with. That's been my observation, and feel free to contradict me on that because I haven't lived here, right? But my perception is that unions have a bit more because they're sort of, I feel like, really coming into their own now, as opposed to a country like Australia where they've been very established for a long time and they occupy one half the political space. Here, I think they've got more room to maneuver because they're growing and because the right here has made some unusual appeals to them. So, and so to put my union hat on as a union strategist, I would use it. I would absolutely use it to get what they want to achieve because that's what they're going to do.
So I think a lot of this kind of is dependent upon, and you brought this up in your initial answer, the rights, like how they're actually going to proceed economically. And what I mean is a lot of the rhetoric that you're talking about where, like they don't like Bezos, right? They don't like big tech. They don't like Twitter or Google or, they don't like any of this stuff. But it seems like their policy doesn't line up with the anti-elite rhetoric. And it seems like a lot of the rhetoric on the right is pretty hollow in that sense because their policy is not going to turn around and tax Jeff Bezos, right? Their policy is not going to turn around and stop giving research and development checks out like candy to these billionaires and all that kind of stuff. So do you see there being any movement to be had in that regard? Or do you think we could almost, like, this might sound bad, but almost just sort of like trick a large portion of the country into falling in line rhetorically and actually supporting a movement that they might not ideologically line up with?
Look, honestly, I don't know, but like I'll tell you what my instinct is. My instinct is because this is so complex that, and I think it's going to. I think more things have to change, right? I think that there's got to be more overlap, and I don't think we're quite there yet. And so I think a few things will happen. Is that one, the passage of time. We have to see. I think you will see the right embrace more of this kind of economic leftist language because just from a tactical perspective, and even just as an experiment. So you'll definitely see more of it tried. I think that will normalize some of that on their side. I think that on our side, I think progressives will have to continue to win fights within the Democratic Party, and actually, make them live up to, at least to some extent, to, what they promised. So I think that what I think we have to see is the normalization of, like, essentially socialist language and policy across the spectrum. Then, and I do see that happening. I definitely see that happening, and an inevitability about that. And I think the last place you'll see it like manifested is, in Congress, right? So that was the next point I wanted to make, is that I think all of these changes will really happen on the local level, right? I think you're not going to see, despite what Ted Cruz is saying, and despite, like Donald Trump, what he did, I still think that you're more likely to see some socially conservative, like some, probably racist person talking economic left-wing language getting elected locally first, right? I think you'll see that first, and that's where I think on their side it will start to get normalized. And on our side, it's progressive victories are more likely to happen locally, right? I mean, not that we're national victories in terms of some national victories, like we, primarying people one by one, et cetera, but I still think our greatest victories will happen locally. So that's, and long story short, the normalization that will get to the point where we're kind of talking the same language on economics will start locally.
Gotcha. And before we pivot to our other topic here, the last thing I wanted to touch on here is whether or not you think, like, how sustainable can that house of cards on the right be? Do you think that right-leaning voters will continue to fall for the rhetoric while they vote for politicians that aren't engaging in like Trump did, right? Trump used some of that pro-worker rhetoric, clearly did not act on it. They still largely support him. How long do you think that rope is before they start to question?
I've been asking myself that question as well. I think that there'll be a limit somewhere, like somewhere soon. It just depends. Like I think, as I said, you got to have that, because I've seen trends on the right towards like that have noticed this. That like I mean, if their dream is always to be a billionaire, like it's only there's questions about how far they'll ever take it. But I think that if they want to make a very serious pitch, and it makes political sense for them to do so, right? To try and exploit, like obviously the progressives are in the Democratic Party are kind of doing what they can to keep workers in the Democratic column, but I'm sure there are many conversations going on saying, look, like especially after all the shit show that's going on, saying, look, if you start losing large swaths of the working class to the Republican Party, don't say we didn't try, didn't warn you, right?
Yeah.
So it's like, if I was a GOP strategist, and hopefully and that's a sentence I never thought I would say, and I never hope to ever say again. But if I were a GOP strategist, I would try and exploit that, the wedge there. Like I'd see the working class and the failed promises coming out of the Democrats as an easy wedge. I would start to pivot on that. I would start to normalize some of that rhetoric, and incorporate it with the culture war stuff, and they can. That's the scary thing, is they can easily coexist, right? Because they're separate. They kind of, in fact, that you can almost like put them together in this sort of anti-elite package, right? Sort of, in a way at least that makes sense for right-wing voters, right? And then they'll realize at some point if they get wins on that, especially if they get some wins, they've already had one, 2016, right? They actually start getting some wins that they're going to have to do on some level. Like you cannot just keep on lying. Like it's one thing to appeal to like a middle class person and say, you'll become a billionaire, like you'll start your own like small, business and you become a billionaire. That's one thing, right? Because that's at least feasible. But like if you're trying to actually get the working class vote to vote for you, that's not going to work. You can't just say, well, like, dear Amazon worker, you could be the next Bezos, right? Like that's just not going to work, right?
You're going to go from breaking your back for 15 an hour to being a billionaire. Yeah.
Right. So they're going to have to deliver something concrete to the working class in their part. So if they want to do that, and right now they're so far away from that, right? Like you look at their votes. Like I was arguing with a conservative friend of mine who actually fits this bill, right? She's quite very socially conservative, but is also like very economically leftist, right? And and I wasn't quite sure how that worked, but I think it's because she's religious actually, and that's where like both of those things flow from her religiousness, which I thought was very interesting. And she was very critical of like the Democrats, and I said, look at your own party. Like don't forget that's 50 votes voting against investment in infrastructure. So we've just got to make that clear. Say, look, don't forget. And for some reason they've been so blinded by this culture war stuff, right? Got to make them aware of like, no, look, and why are they all voting against it? Because they're getting money to do so, right?
Yeah, and that's on both sides. Do you think, I mean, not just your friend in particular, but people who might fall in that kind of ideological category more broadly, do you think, because in my experience, you can get through to some of those people from our perspective if you also acknowledge that the Democrats have basically been trashed for decades? Because then you're not coming at it from this sort of partisan, my team, your team sort of perspective, right? Do you think that there's some room to be had from the left if we kind of acknowledge, listen, we acknowledge our party is shit too, but you kind of got to acknowledge yours is as well. Do you think there's some room to grow there in terms of working outside of the machine with people we might otherwise disagree on certain issues on?
It's already started happening. In fact, that's why that's the crossover with Bernie voters, right? That's why he had an unusual support amongst like people who there were people like I remember in 2016 there were people saying, you know, if Bernie doesn't get the nomination, I'll vote for Trump, and these were people like, or if you know Trump doesn't get it, I'll vote for Bernie. It's like obviously they you know they dislike each other immensely, right?
Right.
You know, but it's not like they're on the same team, but it's more that they saw value in that sort of rebellious attitude, and they saw the overlap there, right? The anti-system thing. So I've long said progressives are the only ones who can reach out, like and one keep. Yeah, well, we're the only ones who can like one keep people in the Democratic column, but you know, but also I guess push the GOP to live up to some of this new rhetoric over time. This is a very long project. This isn't something that happens in the next 5 years. This is a very long project, right?
You mean Mitch McConnell's not going to write a bill tomorrow that's pro-worker?
Funny that. No. So that's not going to happen. Mitch McConnell will be well retired by then.
Oh, so, I think probably in a casket by the time any of this comes true.
Yeah, probably. But yeah, but, you know, you got to see it. Like it'll be interesting to see. And as I said, I'm sure some of your viewers will be listening to this and say he's dreaming, and I'm saying, look, the only reason why I say this is not only likely but inevitable is because there's a political opportunity to exploit there, right? And it's an easy one for them. It's the obvious one to exploit, right? You look at you exploit your opponent's weaknesses, right?
Yeah.
To win. That's how you win. What is the Democrats' greatest weakness right now? It's their failure to deliver to progressives. That's the most obvious thing. And the fact that Trump already created an opening there and won a presidential election. It's such an obvious strategy, right?
Yeah.
And that's what political strategists are, opportunists. Like that's what a good political strategist is. They're an opportunist, right? They see it. They ultimately will abandon ideology in favor of opportunity, right? And there's an opportunity to stay in power.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. So
whether you want to say fortunately or unfortunately, a lot of those operatives have read The Prince and seem to use those ideas in their work. So you're 100% right. When there's something to be exploited, it will be. It's just a matter of by who and when. I think it's fair to present that as inevitable.
Yeah. So to put it bluntly, I think the union movement should play both sides. They absolutely should, right? You know, as a progressive, that makes me upset, but as a unionist, that makes absolute sense. You know.
Yeah, and I think I think accepting someone's support on something is not tantamount to endorsing their cultural views, and I think the left needs to perhaps acknowledge that we could have some people that we think of as unpalatable supporting our movement, and that can be a good thing. And it doesn't have to mean that we're conceding on any issues. It doesn't mean that we're accepting their views. You know, those two things can be separate.
Well, but also the fact that, and I think this is the other difference is, and you know, tell me if I'm wrong, but I don't think that the unions in the US are as wedded to one side of the culture wars as, say, they are in Australia, where they're very wedded to the left, right? You know, in every aspect of the left, not just the working class side, but like on the economic side, but also on the social side too, which has actually caused some friction with some of the membership. But you know, and you have some interesting remnants in Australia. There's actually a political party called the Democratic Labour Party, which is it's like a sort of socially conservative working class party. Like they're very small, but they used to be much larger. Like historically, they were quite large. It was sort of very Catholic, very conservative, very socially conservative, very working class, right? And I think that the union movement, my understanding, and I could be totally wrong on this because I'm new to the country, still relatively new, right, is that I don't see the union movement as wedded to one side or the other, because and also the priority here is that, like, the economic situation for workers is so dire here. Their only priority has got to be economics, and that's why I'm saying got to use every tactic they got, right? Right. If that means playing off candidates, playing off parties against each other, they should, And I think we may have discussed this in a past show, the theory that under the new model of politics, progressives kind of fall towards the center. Have we ever discussed this?
Yeah, I think we have. Yeah. But please, can you give a brief, bring the audience up to speed on that?
Yeah. So, I mean, how I imagine.
Also, just quickly, a little behind the scenes stuff for the audience. Vinay, I'm going to grab a cup of coffee. I'm still listening in my earbud, but you're going to see me walk away, and I didn't want you to think I was leaving. So please begin your explanation, and I will be back in 10 seconds.
Okay, no worries. Okay, so just a kind of a brief theoretical background on it is that many of you are probably aware of the political compass. Most of you are probably aware of the political compass. It's the left-right economic axis, and then the top-down, there's the authoritarian libertarian axis, right? And you create 4 quadrants, and it's been a really good summary of politics kind of until now. If someone is authoritarian and economic right, they're sort of where like the modern, well, actually where a lot of modern politics is, but theoretically, it's like sort of like, where the Republican Party is. If someone is in their more libertarian and they're more economically left, they might be where say the Green Party is located. They've got a sort of an anarchist bent to them, and so that's served politics relatively well for quite a long time. Do you think I need to say any more about the political compass, or?
I think most of my audience is probably up to date on at least that. Yeah.
Okay. So the theory that someone put to me, and I think it's a really powerful theory, is that it's time to add a z-axis to the political compass, of a third dimension, and you make that globalization and your relationship with globalization as the z-axis. And what you suddenly see is that you'll still keep the x and y, but if you add the z-axis, you suddenly see all these new dimensions appear, and you start to understand contemporary politics much better. Because where do the Democrats say fall in their relation? Like mainstream Democrats fall in their relationship with globalization. Very supportive of it. They're at the top of the z-axis, right? Where do a lot of mainstream Republicans, like old school Republicans, fall? Also quite close to the top of that z-axis. Where do the Trump people fall? The very bottom. Well, at the very bottom of that z-axis. They're anti-globalization, everything about it, right? They hate multinational corporations. They hate immigration. They hate the UN. They hate anything.
After all of it.
Right. Where do the Bernie people and the progressives fall? Sort of in halfway, because they are obviously we oppose many aspects of economic globalization, but we're supportive of immigration. We believe we need a good United Nations system, better than what we currently have, right? We believe there's probably room for stronger international law and better governance on that front to constrain some of the excesses of multinational corporations. So what happens is that we're literally, under this model, we're the centrists of the modern era, which explains why there's kind of, and that's, I know that's a scary idea for us to be branded as centrists. We don't want to think of ourselves as radicals, right? But ideologically, we kind of fall in between. And that's why we kind of look at the role we're playing in starting to play in Congress, right? Like, even though that it's sort of seeing like on one, you could say like, and the media presented, I was the far left of the party versus the centrist, right? The centrists under the mainstream Democrats, the centrists under the old model, the one that didn't account for globalization, right? Because if you think about it, like the Trump people don't actually fit under the old model at all, right? Because they're simultaneously very authoritarian and very anti-authoritarian, right? Like they're basically fascists, right? But they're also extremely against the status quo, which doesn't actually make sense, right? So what they're against is a particular type of status quo, right? And they want to replace it with something from the 1950s or earlier, right? But so that's why you've got to add that Z-axis, right? And everything makes sense now, right? Because you think, like, for me, all of politics since Brexit has been dominated by the question of globalization, right? Everything is our relation, like all this union stuff we're talking about is why have workers been disempowered by Amazon, because Amazon is a multinational corporation, right? That has probably threatened to just take its workers offshore, right? Globalization is the theme of our time, so it has to be accounted for, right? So I don't know. You can feel free to disagree or whatever.
No, I think you're spot on, Vinay. I mean, in fact, I would bring up the example of Mark Blythe, who's an economist at Brown. It was about a year before Trump was elected, which was about a year before Brexit too. I might have the timeline a little bit off, but it was at that point in time, everyone expected that Brexit would be, fail miserably, and that Trump would fail miserably and Hillary would win the presidency by a wide margin. And he gave some sort of conference or talk or something in Europe where he pretty famously predicted both Brexit and Trump's election. And he's not like a right-wing guy. He's a lefty, So I think it was exactly what you're speaking to that led him to draw those conclusions, is these changing winds on trade in the various ideological sections. So I think you're spot on, and I think that that's an incredibly important thing to notice. I would also point out one thing that's confused me that this would make sense. This idea you're talking about, it's been confusing to me how the mainstream Democrats get the label of being more anti-Trump than progressives are, even though ideologically, the mainstream Democrats are not that far from Trump, quite frankly. I mean, on some issues they are, but they're certainly closer to Trump than Bernie is. I'll put it that way. But on trade, that's maybe an issue where that actually doesn't hold true. And that could perhaps explain some of those dynamics, where it seems to me like the left should be treated as more anti-Trump than the Hillary Clintons and Joe Bidens of the world. But in effect, it's quite the opposite, right?
Yeah, I think though that's because there are other issues that have been brought into politics. I would still say that like because I think there's more. So when we say anti-Trump, I think that, so for me, I spend a lot of time trying to understand Trump voters, right? I'm not obviously, and I think that I empathize with them to the extent that a political, because, one, I enjoy political strategy and I like understanding where people are coming from, and two, that's how you win elections, right? And win people over. And I think that, but obviously, I don't agree with any of their culture war stuff, right? At all, literally none of it. But I think though that process of empathizing from a tactical perspective just doesn't happen amongst mainstream Democrats. They just don't do it at all. It's just they're the absolute enemy. They're the devil. And look, I get where they're coming from, because there's a lot that's pretty abhorrent, right?
Right.
And so I think to that extent there, the fact that progressives are willing to empathize, and even Bernie did it too. He would say, look, we lost the Midwest. He would go on and say, we lost the Midwest because Trump went around promising to bring back jobs. And, a lot of Bernie's campaign surrogates were saying that, I remember, John Cusack made that the centerpiece of his Bernie surrogacy. So I think that to that on that level, I think they are more anti-Trump. And I think on the other thing too is that a lot of new stuff has been brought into play in politics, right? Which is the question of the system and the questions of science as well, right? Like these were things that like have never been political issues before. Like, you know, like science is just, as far as I'm aware, has never been a political issue until like now. So, you know, and I think what you'll see is that like the Trump folk are just decidedly anti-science in just every respect, really. Like there's, and you know, a lot of the people, the mainstream Democrats are extreme, like will just always back whatever science says. And I think what we find is amongst progressives is a mix. Like, unfortunately, you know, we should admit to it. Like, and this is my perspective. You know, we've got a group of people who are like, you know, in house who are anti-vaxxers. Like, I clearly don't agree with them, but in a less dangerous way, I think, you know, you'll also find people amongst progressives who are pro-vaccine but understand where the opposition is coming from, because it's say, look, it's the structures of like big pharma are creating it, so we get why people don't trust it. And look, I think that's a sensible position, because then you open your eyes saying, well, look, this might be the best way to protect the community right now, but let's find something better, right? So I think that the existence of that understanding, that empathy of the other side, does put us in the middle. And I think that on the question of the system, right, like the status quo, mainstream Democrats, for the most part, want to uphold the status quo, right? And that has doubled down since January 6th, right? It's become like, and what is the system? The system, you know, the structures of power that exist, whether it be, and then that's obviously covers a lot. That includes like, you know, the economic system, that includes the political system, includes globalization, includes the UN, all of that, right? Right wingers of today just oppose all of it, right? It's all bad. Well, to some extent, I mean, especially like, you know, the whole thing as a blob is bad, and we should just destroy it. That's their approach. And they don't even have an alternative really, except fascism. That's their alternative. Whereas I think, you know, and you look at the dialogue on amongst Democrats, it's just, we have to defend the status quo against this, you know, the tides of darkness, the hordes, right? And you look at the dialogue amongst progressives, it's very much, well, the system is shit and needs to be changed, but we still need a system. It's not like the system is bad, but it's not like we want to replace it with no system. Like, we need an alternative system. And that means you can't just destroy, right? And that's why, you know, a lot of people fault Bernie for like not going to war with Joe Biden, right? And, you know, he could have just knuckled down and just said, you know, fuck you all, and he could have. He could have. But ultimately, he's a pragmatist, in the sense that, not because he believed necessarily that it was going to get great stuff out of the Biden administration. It was simply that if they win, if the Trumpers win, we are all worse off, right? Because they don't have an alternative. They don't have a plan. We go into fascism, and fascism is worse, right? Fascism is worse, because at least under democracy, there's like some kind of possibility of change. Like, at least you're able to speak up, right? Like, our voice isn't constrained. You know, that's the one, like, you know, like voting might be an illusion, right? And there are many people who validly believe that, right? And I think that's, you know, to some extent that is true, especially, you know, the amount of donations. Voting is often an illusion. But under fascism, we don't even get to organize. Like, we don't have unions anymore, right? You know, so we don't get to come together in groups and have our own opinion, right? So the very basic steps needed for systemic reform don't happen under fascism. right?
No, I think that's totally fair. And actually that's coming from like, I'm someone who was very, and to this day is very critical of Bernie's lack of going after Joe Biden in the primary. I totally see that at the same time. And I think you're right. Like especially in general elections, it does feel like an illusion or some sort of, it doesn't feel real because you're handed these two choices that no one really likes, that the corporations and the banks and the military contractors bought to get to that point. And then you're told pick between these two, and it just feels very, it doesn't feel democratic. It doesn't feel like you have a say in the matter. So I understand that sort of disenfranchised feeling. And I understand Bernie's pragmatic approach to that. But, again, I think he should have gone after Joe in the primary. And then if it comes to the general, but at the same time, like two things can be true. And I think you're exactly right. I mean, I think
I'm talking more about the question of endorsing him after.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. And campaigning for him. But yeah, I think he could have gone harder on him. Definitely, absolutely should have. But, but I think that the weight of, potentially blaming himself for 2016 and its outcome, even though that's not fair.
It's not logical, but that's what the whole media did. So I get why he would start to internalize that a little bit, even though it, like, to me, it doesn't follow at all. But like you say.
Yeah. So, like, what does all this mean is that, like, I think that, like, I don't mind being called, centrist in that of the modern era. And the reason is because everyone runs to the rule of politics is everyone runs towards the center in the end, right? It means we have the power to shape things, right? And we just have to realize that. Like, I think so much power lies in the hands of progressives, more than I ever thought would have, right? Because of the way the world is turning out. But it also means we've got a big responsibility, I think, to build that alternative, right? And I think and I think we're only babies at the moment when it comes to building that alternative. And I look at, some of the ideas you and I have discussed are actually very friendly to everyone across the political spectrum. I will keep on talking about worker co-ops till the day I die, because I have yet to find anyone who has a serious objection to them. Like, I find people will just, raise some minor objections to it, but you generally, no one is like staunchly against them. Everyone from, like, I've had, I've heard Trump people say that they sound like an excellent idea. And these are people who are like, and their idea, like, and I'm talking about like actual fascists, right? And these are people who are probably going to go off and start some sort of like racially segregated fascist commune somewhere. But it's probably going to be legally structured as a worker co-op, right? And, and they'll grow their own food. And so obviously that's not a welcome development, but that's politics, right? Unwelcome things happen. So,
and if it's how things are headed, we need to like acknowledge reality, right? We have to work within that the framework of reality if we want to actually accomplish anything. I think I laugh, but that's just a visceral response. I think you're right. I mean, it sounds so ludicrous and ridiculous, but I think you're probably right. That is where we're headed. And to pivot to something that's tangentially related, I don't want to take up too much of your time today, but I did want to get to your thoughts on you had wanted to talk about how the right wing sort of identifies and how you saw this in a very popular TV show. So I'd just like to give you the floor here and explain your thoughts on this, because I'm fascinated to hear them.
Yeah, so this actually kind of stemmed from an article I read some time ago that the show The Walking Dead is disproportionately, massively popular amongst conservatives. And I went and like talked to some conservatives, and it's almost like, especially like some in political space, they love it. They love it. And you look at where the show is most popular. It's most popular in red areas. And I was like, this is really weird. What's going on? And I've never seen like a TV show do this, especially one which isn't like overt in its and it's not overt in its politics at all. But in fact, there are certain, there are things that are surprising, like, because it's actually has some very open, like gay and like biracial relationships and things like that. Like they're very normal in this show. And at one point in the show, and I'm sure most of you viewers are probably familiar with the show in a general sense, right?
I would hope so. I mean, I haven't watched a whole lot of it, but I've seen a few episodes, and I'm very familiar with what it is in the broad cultural,
Right. Okay. So I mean, I'll give a very quick summary of it. It's just that it's about the zombie apocalypse, right? It's about and it follows a southern sheriff. Actually, he's from a small town in Georgia, and most of the show is set. In fact, the entire show is set in the South, right? I don't think that's why it's popular in the South, but maybe it's something to do with it. But I think it's mostly set in Georgia and then moves towards Virginia later in the show. But it follows this this sheriff who wakes up he's from a coma, and he'd been shot actually in the course of law enforcement, ended up in a coma, and when he wakes up, the world is literally zombies. Like, and so he's like, "What's going on? I have to go find my family." And he goes and befriends like someone, a family saves him, like a man and his son, and they like, and then from there he goes and he does find his family, and the sort of adventures begin. And the sort of the overarching theme of the show and the comics on which it's based, and this is the comic author Robert Kirkman has actually said this. He said that in an apocalypse, it's not the zombies that will be the main threat; it's other people. And which I thought was like fascinating, and it really, really plays into that, because it sort of traces like almost the rebuilding of human society. And I think in many ways it's like kind of, and I saw some like other interpretations of why The Walking Dead was popular amongst conservatives. They said, this like, the zombies represent immigrants, but I don't think that's actually it. I think that's kind of too simplistic, but I think it's much more that that idea that deep down, like the truth is in that show, the zombies are sort of a metaphor for humanity in its fundamental state. And that, in fact, and the show actually very much plays on that at one point. Like, I think there's season 3, they they start with zooming out from the eye of a zombie outwards, and then in the final episode of that season, they zoom out from the eye of the governor, who's the main villain in that, in a way that echoes that. So they're literally saying that it's exactly, and there's one of the most famous lines from the comic, which is also in the show, said by the main character, is "We are the Walking Dead." And I think what they're all trying to say is that at its heart, humans are this sort of ravenous, horrible creature, right? And we have to start from that assumption about humanity and build society on that assumption.
So do you think it's almost sort of playing into that like Hobbesian conservative ideological view of the world? Is that kind of the idea?
Absolutely. And the main, and then what do you do in response to that, right? Is that you have to be tough, right? And like the main character is like he's a sheriff, like, and that's interesting because he's someone who upholds law and order, right? That's what he does, and he tries to do his best and he tries to do good, but he's constantly pushed and pushed and pushed by all the people around him, and he has to sort of embrace his own darker instincts over the course of the series, and to the point where he's almost indistinguishable from the villains. And and there's an interesting thing where like later in the his group has been on the road for a long time and they've become survivors, they've become tough, and the show really places a lot of value on being strong and being survivors, right? And they go into this town which had been walled up, like they built walls early in the apocalypse and everyone just sort of lived behind it, and they've sort of they've just lived like normal society. And the show presents them as like really weak, right? But also, then to its credit, it's subtle because it's unclear if our protagonists have actually become the villains, right? Because they're like, if these people are too weak, we'll take the town from them, it's like they actually, definitely, and the show doesn't say this is a good thing, but in the end, what happens is that they kind of meet an equilibrium where the protagonists end up saying, look, you're shit. You've been walled up. You're not ready to survive in the world if you try and engage with it. So we're going to teach you. And there's it's one of the most famous scenes in the show where the hero says, look, we're going to teach you to be better. We're going to make you better. And that's kind of how, and it's this, how I think the show sort of reaches this point and say, well, look, you've got to be strong, but everyone can be strong. And it's the duty of the strong to like empower those who are not as strong and then help. Everyone can be strong. Right. And this is the interesting thing, though, is that it's like, as I said, because it's very survivalist, they also like do away with stupid things, and they make fun of anti-homosexual attitudes at one point. Like there's one of the main characters, not the main character, one of the main characters is gay, right? And he's one of the heroes, and he and Daryl, who's like this very macho kind of, Daryl's like this sort of epitome of macho-ness. He and the gay character actually become really good friends, and they kind of bond over their outsiderness, and they sort of laugh about how stupid people are, have their old preserved attitudes. Which I think is really interesting. And, the main character gets into like a biracial relationship. And obviously those are going to happen in Apocalypse because, there are, even if you're a racist or whatever, there just aren't many people around, right? But also I think it's just showing that, it's a common humanity against that. But even more interestingly is they all end up setting up communes. Like they essentially become this very flat, and they actually go to war with these, like one of the main villains of the show actually has this extremely Hobbesian view, like the Negan. You've probably heard of him, even if you don't watch the show, you would have heard of him, right? He's got this belief that like he's got an even more extreme version of this strong must survive kind of view, and like saying, and what they do is they go and essentially create like a protection racket, and they enslave all these other communities and who have to go and work for them and bring them stuff. So they create like a feudal system and say, oh, look, we'll protect you. So it's like a feudal system, right? But the protagonists end up allying with all those other communities and overthrowing it. So it's got quite an egalitarian viewpoint as well. And the last season of the show and of the comics is there's a very large community with 50,000 people who have tried to recreate the world as it was, and they essentially create a caste system. And it's presented as a negative thing, like, and one of the characters actually, one of the protagonists, she is a Harvard lawyer, like in a former life, and she gets an in because she has like this old status, right? And she totally disagrees with how they do things, but that's how they she gets an in into the system, and they make her a judge and all that within their system. But that's presented as this very negative thing. So they present equality, like economic equality, as a very good thing. So I've always found this fascinating. So, but yeah, and I was like, why? So why is it so popular with conservatives? And I think it's because fundamentally I do think they view humanity as dark and as this dark animalistic thing. But they also, I think that what the show presents is that from that good can emerge, but you have to be willing to fight for order, which is such a right-wing viewpoint, right?
Yes, it's a meritocratic. Everyone has the equal chance to do this or that. That's a very yes.
Oh no, not even. It's not even meritocracy. It's more about just strength. Like you will die, and the world will kill you unless you fight. And like law and order can exist, but it requires like punching your way through the world first.
Mm-hmm.
Which, and on top of that, you can build like an egalitarian and even perfect sort of society, which is really interesting. I think, because they're essentially the result of that is something that looks quite communist, right?
Right. Yeah.
And communist not in the like authoritarianism, but in like an anarchist sort of sense, right?
Yes, like the actual economic structure of that. So do you think that like this is obviously an anecdotal one show kind of a thing. I don't mean to like, project it onto the entire conservative movement, but do you think that that might be a sign of changing attitudes on certain cultural issues, that they're accepting of the cultural, I don't want to like say progressivism, but it's clearly not a culturally conservative show, and yet there is that Hobbesian that sort of underlies the whole thing. Do you think that that's actually indicative of changing attitudes, or do you think I might just be reading too much into that?
I don't know. I think that, I can't say, but I think that the appeal of the show is that it reinforces the sort of the dark view of humanity, right? So, and it's possible they just tolerate all that stuff, So I can't say, but I think that like for me that dark view of humanity is more fundamental than even like and I think it's a more nuanced perspective on conservatism, and a more interesting one, and one that I can even get behind to some extent, than like something cliched like being a racist or being sexist. Like that stuff is very cliched, right? And I think that if you look at what the heart of conservatism has meant over all the course of human history, it has meant the preservation of order, because there's chaos the chaos outside is worse, right? And I think that's fundamental, and the show very much reinforces that idea, right? So I can't say, but I think it's certainly opened a very large swath of of a certainly the voting base. It was popular. It was at one point, it was like had 20 million viewers at one point. It's a lot smaller now, but it's still popular. To those perspectives, and it's also quite gender egalitarian as well. Interestingly,
what do you mean by that?
By as in it presents both, like in terms of who. So I mean, arguably the strongest character in the show is Michonne.
I see.
Yeah, so it's, and in fact it says like the message about strength applies to everybody, right? It doesn't matter what your gender is. Like you just have to be strong and armed. If you're strong and armed, and then there's then that's all. Then you'll survive, right? And they present that irrespective of gender. There's actually a lot of other kind of conservative nods throughout the show as well that I don't know if they're deliberate or not. Like, so one of them is again season 3, where this is, and Michonne is actually presented as this as kind of as the ideal. So what happened? I don't know if you saw season 3 at all.
I saw a few. My ex roommate watched the show a lot when it first came out, so I saw a few episodes of like season 1.
Okay. So you wouldn't even have met Michonne. All right. So, but she and Andrea, who are you would have met in season 1 actually. They both show up in this town. Like they've been on the road for like months and they're kind of sick, but they show up in this nice walled community, and Andrea is presented like she kind of trusts the community very quickly and trusts its leader, the governor, and he's this very charming, charismatic, and nice guy. Like he looks after them and all of that. And Michonne, she's presented as like kind of tough, distrustful. And she's presented as the wise one, because as you quickly see is that the governor is this like con man and a psychopath, and he does like really fucked up things. Like he goes they find this National Guard helicopter that crashes, and they rescue a soldier from it, and he tells the soldier, say, look, I'll go and, where did you come from? He said, I came from this base. I'll go, and he says, oh, look, I'll go and rescue those people, like at your base. Just tell me where they are while you recover. And they go, and then they go and like, and they say, look, we're here to save you. And then while their backs are turned, they shoot them all and take all their equipment. And then come back and then say to the town, say, look, you know, it was too late. You know, the zombies got to them, and but it's a great. We're able to make use of this and their sacrifice. And then Michonne, who's presented as the kind of the smart one here, she says, oh, you know, I wonder if the zombies have figured out how to use bullets, how to use guns or bullets here. Yeah. So I think that's almost like I read that as like a critique of like sort of like liberal naivety. Like that's kind of how that whole season played. Is that, you know, the person who was distrustful was presented as the smart one, right? And Andrea like eventually does, you know, she suffers a fate because of she trusts too much and only realizes too late. And she's actually like presented as this person who wants to like bring peace and she's presented as this kind of before the times person, like you know, as like she, in fact, later she tries to be a diplomat, and you know, she tries to see the good in everyone, and so that, I think that's quite, for me, that was quite a strong like kind of nod to a conservative viewpoint. And later, and this is actually very new. I don't know if this is deliberate or if this is just where the show is going, but it turns out, and this is kind of a spoiler, so spoiler alert. Do you mind if I say it? Do you mind if I say hello?
Yeah, please do. Go ahead. I'm sorry. I was muted. I got a train going by. Yeah, please do.
Okay. So spoiler alert for the cause of the apocalypse. So for anyone who's still watching the show and doesn't want to know, okay. It's revealed in one of the companion shows that it's caused by a group of scientists, and one of the like scientists who were experimenting. And interestingly, in one of the companion shows, one of the scientists who sort of works for the villains openly says she used to work for Big Pharma. And you know, there's a whole kind of thing about and how she's like willing to experiment on people, and you know, and then consequences catch up with her, and so and then the same scientists, as it turns out, end up making a worse strain of the zombie virus, where, you know, before the Walking Dead, and like in the latest, like in the last shot of one of the companion shows, they're actually quite strong and they can run now, and you know. And this new strain happened because the scientists were trying to fix it and they ended up making it worse. So,
oh my God, this all was pre-COVID, right? This storyline was
No,
by a wide. Oh, okay.
Yeah. So, but I mean, I think they may have been thinking about it for a few years, but it came out very much into the pandemic. So, and it's going to dominate,
because that so lines up with like the gain of function, the possibility of a lab leak. I mean, it's too lined up with that's incredible.
Yeah. So I don't know if that's like there are more and more nods to, to the conservative movement. But I still think, you know, the heart of it, the most interesting part of it, like rather than the sort of those plot lineups, for me the interesting part is the idea that, you know, the view that humanity is sort of lost at its core, right? And that, but even then, you can, if you're willing to fight for your values, you can build a good society off of that, despite humanity being awful. And that requires you to tap into your own darkness to fight that darkness. So I think that's the heart of the show, and which I think
that's a fascinating theme.
Yeah, and it is a kind of it's a very, and I think actually interestingly, to go back to some of the stuff we were talking about earlier, I think that's another reason why kind of progressives are right in the middle, because I think progressives do have a darker view of humanity than liberals do.
Yeah.
I think that they view human beings as, if not evil, but as kind of greedy, like
self-interested. Yes. Yeah.
And that's why structures should exist to prevent that. And we need to build structures to stop that. Which, again, I think that it lines up. And it's why we have some common interest with those who want to see, disruption of the system.
Well, yeah, I mean, it really actually kind of ties together. It seems like a theme in the show. You said a few times that there's this sort of almost conflation of trust with being naive. And I think that actually could be one of those points of not like agreement, but points of consensus between people who are maybe on completely different parts of the political spectrum. And I think that there is like the partisan Democrats, the liberals of society, I think they do tend to be more trusting of institutions and trusting of the status quo. And that could be one of those sort of points of consensus. I think that's a really fascinating theme. And I'm curious, for you as a lefty, a progressive, do you just enjoy the show because it's really well made and it's a good entertainment, or is there something politically that you're pulling out of it that's giving you enjoyment?
Just before I answer that, I forgot the last part, which is actually probably the funniest part. It hasn't been revealed yet, but it's very likely that the main villains of the show are the remnants of the US government.
No.
Which, and there's a whole bunch of clues starting to point that way. So if that's true, then that would just
that would amplify the whole. That's insane. Yeah.
I think to answer your question, I think that because I'm someone who actually subscribes to that sort of Hobbesian viewpoint, right? Like I think that I believe that our reptilian function is there, but it's a survival mechanism, right? And it's not always just because it's there doesn't mean we're always using it. Right? We only use it when material conditions or our survival is threatened, right?
Like an apocalypse.
Well, yeah, or when you're poor, right?
Yeah.
Like if you're and that's why it's so important to ensure that people have a basic level of survival, because without that, we have a societal wide interest. Like even if you don't have basic compassion, even if that's not in your interest for whatever reason, we all lose if the worst parts of us are brought out. The worst parts are brought out if people are suffering, right? Suffering brings out the worst parts of humanity. It's always there. And so I think, if we have, from a meta standpoint, unless we solve poverty, right? Unless we bring everyone along with us, we don't just concentrate material security in the hands of a few, then this society will be destroyed, right?
Yeah.
And then you'll get your apocalypse, right?
Yeah.
So
that certainly puts a twist on The Walking Dead for the audience. I'm now fascinated to go watch it and have that sort of lens. And I'm very curious about that U.S. government little twist that may be forming. I'm very glad you brought this topic up, because I think there are some fascinating parallels there between the political environment right now and the ideologies and how people might view that show. That is incredibly fascinating to me.
Glad to hear it.
Well, thank you, Vinay. I really appreciate you taking the time today, and I'm sure we'll have you on again soon. Just really appreciate it as always.
No worries. Thanks again.
So I thought that was a fantastic discussion as always, Vinay, on point with labor issues and always has some fascinating takes on political identity and how we have come to the sort of cultural positions that we've come to and what dominates narratives in our political process and things of that nature. So Vinay will be a regular guest as always going forward. Look forward to talking to him again soon. I apologize for my audio on that, you guys. I don't know how I screwed that setting up, but my mic was not on, so you were hearing me through my shitty laptop microphone. So I apologize for that and the little bit of echo there when we would go back and forth and things. But fantastic discussion. Thank you to Vinay again for taking the time. So I wanted to move on here to a story about we've kept up on Jeffrey Epstein's, the fallout from everything that came out about Jeffrey Epstein, the Maxwell trial, et cetera, all the powerful people who have been inundated from any form of accountability on this issue. There's another, sort of story out here. This is in BBC. It's from a handful of days ago. Prince Andrew accusers' 2009 deal with Jeffrey Epstein made public. So this is about a secret agreement pertaining to Prince Andrew and Epstein and the crimes that they're accused of. Virginia Giuffre, who is one of the high-profile accusers, accuses Prince Andrew of having sex with her. I mean, she didn't mince words. Virginia Giuffre agreed not to sue anyone connected. And by the way, I don't mean to frame it that way. That's rape. She was underage. So it's rape. I just want to be very clear. Virginia Giuffre agreed not to sue anyone connected to Jeffrey Epstein who could be described as a potential defendant. A 2009 damages settlement against the sex offender shows. The document disclosed by a New York court reveals the financier paid her $500,000 or 371,000 pounds to end her claim. Ms. Giuffre is suing the Duke of York in a civil case for allegedly sexually assaulting her 20 years ago when she was a teenager. He has consistently denied the claims. The document was released ahead of a critical hearing on Tuesday in the civil case involving Prince Andrew, and the interpretation of the settlement will form a central plank of the argument between the two sides. Ms. Giuffre alleges she was trafficked to the prince by Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell. Although the settlement does not mention the prince by name, his lawyers say this 2009 deal means she cannot sue him because she agreed to end all legal action against anyone connected to the offender who could be described as a potential defendant. So this is a very interesting situation in that Prince Andrew and his attorneys seem to kind of want this both ways. They have to use this agreement to try to defend him from further lawsuits and basically say this agreement means that he cannot be sued by Virginia Giuffre going forward. And at the same time, that document in and of itself is pretty damning, right? I mean, you don't sign that document if you're not guilty of something. Prince Andrew has purported to be cooperative and has tried to message as though he is cooperating with authorities pertaining to the accusations against him, but he has on a number of occasions turned down interviews with law enforcement about this. So he's being kept in the UK because he's a member of the royal family. The British government will not do anything about it, and the United States has certainly been relatively passive in our efforts as well because it is a close ally of ours and a member of the royal family. So this is just another example, you guys, of who gets to get away with what in our society. If you or I did what Jeffrey Epstein or Ghislaine Maxwell or Prince Andrew did, or any other people for that matter, the Clintons or the Trumps or Kevin Spacey or Alan Dershowitz, on and on and on and on, if we engaged in this conduct, we would be held to account for it. We would be in prison, and rightly so, but not Prince Andrew. Not these powerful attorneys and politicians and wealthy elite and celebrities. They get to get away with it scot-free. So this is just quite a revelation, and this is nothing really new to the story to add here. I've discussed the Prince Andrew stuff before, but this was an actual explicit admission that this deal had taken place, that was designed to inundate him from any form of legal action. And Virginia Giuffre is a very credible accuser. She's accused Bill Clinton and Prince Andrew. She is I'm sure a number of you have seen the picture of Bill Clinton getting a massage. That's Virginia Giuffre providing the massage. And she says she was essentially groomed to do so by Ghislaine. So Ghislaine was found guilty, but unfortunately, throughout the process of the trial, the judge effectively sealed a lot of the documents that could have come forward to, provide some transparency about the other powerful people that were involved in this. So it looks like we're not going to get much information coming out. As I said a couple weeks ago, I do actually think it's possible, and I'm not naive enough to expect this, you guys, but it's something I can hope for, right? If you're Ghislaine right now and you're facing the rest of your life in prison, you only have one play left to stay relevant or to potentially, have your sentence in some way reduced or minimized. the only way that she could go about that, and she shouldn't, by the way, just my view is she should be in prison for the rest of her life because she's a fucking criminal. She participated in raping children and grooming children. She should be in prison. But I'm just trying to look at the dynamic and figure out any way by which we might actually get more information. And this is the only way I see it happening, is if Ghislaine realizes that if she wants to, for example, have part of her sentence served on house arrest or something instead of in prison, the only way she's going to get anything like that is actually by coming forward or threatening to come forward. There are a lot of powerful people implicated in this stuff, you guys. So I wonder if the only play that she has now been left with is to expose some of the people involved in this. And perhaps if she starts a little leak of information, perhaps one of those powerful people swoops in and tries to say, hey, I can get your sentence reduced, just shut the fuck up, that kind of thing. So I wonder if there isn't perhaps an avenue here where we could get at least a little bit of information, or start to see, Ghislaine may be willing to come forward with some of the information that she has. We'll see. Again, I'm not naive enough to expect it, you guys. I think they'd probably do what they did to Epstein if that were to happen, and you all know what I'm talking about. Jeffrey Epstein did not kill himself. It's remarkably obvious. So, this is a messy situation, and I just think it's worth pointing out how there are two different sets of rules. There are the rules for the powerful and the wealthy, and then there are the rules for the rest of us. And because of Ghislaine's connections, largely from her father being a socialite in the UK, which gave her connections to the royal family and celebrities and politicians, et cetera, that vicinity to power that she provided to Jeffrey Epstein is a big part of the story and is a big reason why he was able to get away with what he was able to get away with for as long as he was. So that's the part that interests me, is the power dynamics here and how we treat different people in our society, who gets to get away with what. It's very clear here that the powerful get to do whatever the fuck they want, and that includes Prince Andrew. His reputation obviously is shot, but let me just ask you, the viewer at home, would you rather have your reputation shot or spend the rest of your life in prison? Take your choice. Not only is he not in prison, he also still undoubtedly gets to live an incredibly high lifestyle, right? He may not have like the public life that he used to have. He may be ashamed of what people say about him publicly, but he still gets to live a high quality life, right? Would that be true for anybody else who had committed the crimes that he's committed? Of course not. So, and that holds true for the Clintons. That holds true for the Trumps, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The list of people involved with Epstein's crimes seems to be almost endless. So, I will keep up on that story if there are new developments, but I thought it was worth noting that this secret agreement had taken place and that Prince Andrew is essentially trying to both use this agreement to inundate himself from any further action and also try to kind of hide from the implications that this agreement brings about. So it's just an interesting dynamic to me. So I want to talk a little bit about COVID and the Biden administration's refusal to handle it. Do you guys remember during the election how Joe Biden was constantly tweeting? I remember the figure at the time was 220,000 deaths. And Biden kept tweeting about how that was just entirely unacceptable. And he was right, that Trump had mishandled the pandemic, that we had refused to take strong action early enough to deal with it, that, all this kind of stuff. And Biden was tweeting endlessly about it and saying, you need to elect someone who will handle this pandemic and Trump will not. Well, where are we at now? Joe Biden's been in office for a year, almost. Where are we at now? He's refused to go forward with the TRIPS waiver. He's revoked stimulus checks after he gave out less than he promised at the beginning, as though we cannot tell the difference between $1,200 and $2,000. Patently insulting. What else has he done? I mean, really, what else has he done? He's tried to force us all back to work and school. He's refused to engage in any strategy that is not centered around the vaccines. And again, you guys, I encourage everybody to get vaccinated. I had COVID this last week. And I am vaccinated and boosted, and I did not have very bad symptoms. I encourage you to get vaccinated so that if you happen to catch this very contagious variant called Omicron, you don't end up in the damn hospital. Okay. I encourage people to take any strategy that can help to mitigate the spread of this horrible disease. But Biden doesn't seem to. He seems to just want to tell people to get vaccinated and get back to normal. Well, why might that be? Who wants that plan? Big business and big pharma want that plan, right? Let's sacrifice human lives for the largest benefactors of our current economic setup. Right? Let's get kids back to school, not because it's safe or reasonable or healthy to do so. Let's get kids back to school so their parents can get back to work. You all know that's what it's about, right? I'm going to show you guys an article here in a minute that we got the media going full on trying to convince everybody that we need to get back to the office, right? All these fucking CEOs telling you got to get back to work. This is the path we've chosen. We have chosen the rapacious incentives of big pharma and big business over human lives. We refuse to go forward with the TRIPS waiver to vaccinate the world, which allows it makes it significantly more likely that variants like Omicron and other potentially dangerous and especially contagious variants can develop. We have refused to take any strong action on this at all. And when you compare that to Biden's messaging during the campaign, it's quite stark. It's egregious. So where do we sit now? We're well over what are we? 800,000 deaths. So how many of those have happened under Biden? Right? You remember when he was tweeting that the amount of deaths Trump had overseen means that Trump should resign? Should Biden resign? Sure looks like it, because he's done fuck all about dealing with this. Right? He's got his press secretary up there laughing about the concept of giving out free tests. You guys know, an impoverished country, there are impoverished countries around the world who are finding no issue with providing tests and masks and other strategies to their citizens. Did Biden come in and say, let's pay people to stay home so we can actually nip this thing in the bud and go for an elimination strategy? No, of course he didn't. Of course he didn't. Because he's prioritizing big business and prioritizing big pharma. Okay? And that's just egregious. And by the way, you guys, the callousness with which I've heard people all across the political spectrum discuss this. Well, it's only people with comorbidities who are dying from this stuff. Oh, so fuck them, right? We shouldn't form our public policy around helping the little guy, right? Fuck them. Fuck your elderly grandparent. They can go die so that we can get back to normal. The callousness with which I have heard people discuss this is outrageous. Absolutely outrageous. We on the left are supposed to stand up for the downtrodden, to stand up for the little guy, the person left behind, the person who most needs public policy. And what have we done instead? We've basically said, throw them to the wolves so we can get back to work. It's outrageous, you guys. It's beyond outrageous. Joe Biden should resign. This is a scandal. His refusal to deal with this is it's hard to even describe the extent to which he has fucked this up every which way to Sunday. And the Democrats messaging on it too now. I mean, I'll show you guys a tweet here. I'm sure a number of you guys saw this. They tweeted, huge news. Unemployment fell to 3.9% at the end of 2021. It's the biggest single year drop in unemployment on record. I tweeted this out and I said, they kicked everyone off UI and now they're boasting about it. That is what happened, okay? They kicked everyone off unemployment insurance and now they're bragging about it. Is that how you're going to win the midterm, you absolute morons? The other thing about this, by the way, they're using, it's this very hilarious dynamic. The unemployment statistics that are used by any given group. If you're in power, you manipulate and water down the unemployment numbers. You don't include the underemployed. You don't include people who are, quote, not seeking work because there's no work for them to seek. So you give the lowest possible number while your opponent gives a more comprehensive and complete number and says, look how bad they're doing. And then when Democrats inevitably lose Congress in 2022 and inevitably lose to Donald Trump or whatever Republican runs in 2024, the Democrats will go back to using the comprehensive set of numbers to criticize Republicans, and Republicans will start using the watered down numbers to say, look how good it's hilarious. It's absolutely hilarious. It's also quite sad because the fact that they continue to engage in it means that on some level it works, right? But it's just this, it defines political messaging because it's not actually about truth or reality. It's about propaganda and manipulating the viewer into taking your side on a micro issue, right? So I also wanted to show you guys here a clip. This is all, I have a handful of things here that are kind of related to COVID in one fashion or another. This clip is actually an advertisement for Big Pharma and how they're attempting to message their desire to have it both ways. By that, I mean, let's take a whole bunch of public funding for research and development and then monopolize the profits on our life-saving vaccines and medications, right? The greedy incentive structure on which they operate and on which our powerful our parties allow them to continue to operate and have for decades is outrageous. So this is a short ad here from Big Pharma. Apologies to make you all watch this.
Vaccines and antivirals are helping fight the pandemic because scientists and researchers in America's biopharmaceutical industry acted fast after investing billions over years to achieve breakthroughs. But now, Congress is threatening legislation that will devastate private industry's ability to fund treatments just like these. What's at stake isn't corporate profits, it's public preparedness. Tell Congress to oppose legislation that would harm our ability to fight pandemics. Paid for by Coalition to Protect Access.
Unfucking believable. This from the same people who oppose the TRIPS waiver. This from the same people who say, no, let's not vaccinate the world. Let's make sure that Pfizer and Moderna and Johnson & Johnson can rake in their profits, excuse me. Unbelievable. And by the way, they even explicitly said, this is not about corporate profits. That is exactly what it's about. Exactly what it is about. If you demanded that these companies fund their own research and development, they would just refuse to produce a whole lot of the drugs and medications that we need. They would just refuse. But when you provide the public funding to develop these drugs and medications and vaccines, they then turn around and say, but we have to monopolize the profits or else you're stifling innovation. They want it both ways, just like every corporation wants it both ways in every aspect of their existence, right? They want to exploit their worker. They want the market to be such that they get to exploit the worker to the maximum degree. And when it hinges in the other direction, even the tiniest little bit, they throw a fucking fit. They have a temper tantrum like a petulant little child. And that's exactly what they did here. By the way, what Congress is proposing is never going to go far enough to oppose the greed that Big Pharma engages in. Big Pharma should be nationalized tomorrow. Big Pharma should be nationalized because then it could actually work in the best interest of the public as opposed to serving a bunch of shareholders and executives who want a nice fat bonus check and a bunch of dividends. We should shift the incentives to be a public incentive instead of a profit incentive. They even said right there in the ad, this isn't about corporate profits. Yes, it fucking is. That's all it's about. That's all it's about. So they'll run ads like this while they oppose the TRIPS waiver and try to play good guy like they have the Superman cape on because they took billions. You guys, do you realize the 3 vaccines that are being used in the United States? There were built to over $2.5 billion in public funding from the United States and from Germany. BioNTech, which worked with Pfizer, is a German company. So $2.5 billion in public funding went to these vaccines. And what do they turn around and say? No, we get to monopolize the profits. And we also want to portray ourselves as heroes. We want to cosplay as though we're fucking Superman. It's nauseating. If that doesn't make your stomach lurch, you're not paying any attention, okay? So this is the path that we have chosen. Instead of taking a policy that is in the interest of the public, providing vaccine access to the entire world to try to stave off future variants, right? Utilizing masks, paying people to stay home, keeping kids out of school so we don't amplify the spread of this already horrendous disease. Instead of taking any of these steps, what do? We cater to and grovel to big business and big pharma with all of our policy decisions and say, at least we're not Trump. Now, if you think that's going to convince anybody to vote Democrat in the midterms, you're off your fucking rocker, okay? Also wanted to show you guys another clip sort of related here. This is Joe Scarborough, Morning Joe, who is sitting in an isolated studio accusing, you'll see, it's a short clip. He's condemning teachers for not wanting to sacrifice their lives and their loved ones so that kids can go back to school, which, by the way, it's not even about the kids. Don't ever fall for that line. I want kids in school too, you guys. Of course I want kids back in school, not when there's a deadly virus going around. The reason they want kids back in school is so their parents can go back to work. It's that simple. Okay? It's a corporate incentive that is driving all of this. So this is a short clip of Joe Scarborough being the ass that Joe Scarborough is.
You don't want to teach, don't teach. Quit. Just stay at home and stop teaching children, okay? Because when you set up that barrier to getting back to class, when healthcare officials say that you can still be testing positive 30 days after, well, you obviously, if that's your standard, you're either ignorant when it comes to science, or you just don't want to be in classes. And if you don't want to be in classes, that's fine. Listen, thank you for your service to our children. Now go get another job.
So in response to the union.
Joe is sitting in a quarantined, isolated studio while he says this. Please remember that. While he tells teachers who make what? 1,000th of what he makes in a year? While he tells them, and you got to get back to work. You got to sacrifice yourself and everyone you interact with. And if not, you should just fucking quit. Fuck you. How on your high horse can you possibly be? This is the attitude that the liberal elite have taken. This is, by the way, who is supposed to be pro-teacher, pro-education, pro-worker, pro-working class, pro-blue collar? Which party is that supposed to be? The one that Joe purports to support. They're telling on themselves, you guys. They're telling on themselves. Follow the money, follow their incentive all the way through, right? And I have one other, this was actually an article, but I'm going to show you guys the tweet. This is from CNBC, which is a starkly pro-business outlet. They talk stocks and finances, and they're just incredibly pro-bank and pro-business, right? They tweet out, young employees are losing out, quote, on a lot, end quote, by not going to the office, business experts say. I went through and read this piece because I didn't want you all to have to. Here's who their sources are. You really cannot make this shit up. This is why I retweeted this. Guess who their sources are? You simply cannot make this shit up. 2 CEOs, including Jamie fucking Dimon, someone from McKinsey, and a business professor. That's who they sourced to say that young people are missing out on a lot. Now, they got rightly eviscerated for this. You can see the ratio there. 5,400 quote retweets to 800 likes. So people are no longer falling for this shit, and I'm incredibly glad to see that. But it's no less egregious, and it's no less worth pointing out that this is the kind of rhetoric that they're engaging in, right? So it all ties it together. This is all in the name of the profits of a few. And there's another angle to this too, you guys. There are a lot of giant financial institutions who make a lot of their money renting out business offices. Well, if people aren't going to go, but what if a company decides, hey, half of our workers can work from home, so we're right now we're renting out 2 floors. We're going to go ahead and just rent out 1 floor. You're now cutting into the profits of the BlackRocks of the world, okay? So that is the underpinning of all of this. It is a financial incentive. And by the way, that's not even a micro concept alone. If you start cutting into their profits in that way, you're also removing demand for commercial real estate. And if you have less demand, even if someone comes in and replaces that specific floor, if on the by and large you see less demand for commercial real estate, then the BlackRocks of the world can't price gouge to the degree that they currently do. The underpinnings of these incentive structures are all financial and corporate related. It's all about serving big business, serving big finance, serving big pharma. It's disgusting. It's pathetic how we are so servile towards these powerful industries. And I just wanted to make sure to note that it's very obvious that while the Democrats may have run on handling COVID, they have essentially just decided to throw everybody to the wolves, especially the elderly, especially those who may be immune compromised. And I want to say, I know I say this every time I bring it up, you guys, but please consider the domino effect. Please take this shit seriously. Please wear a mask. Please distance. Please treat your fellow community members with the dignity that they deserve. Do your part to not spread this stuff around, please. I mean, you don't know who that person that you're interacting with in that moment might interact with. Think about the chain of interactions that could follow, and the likelihood that somebody who is immunocompromised, or somebody who is elderly, or somebody who is too young to get the vaccine or the booster is part of that chain of interactions. Okay? With the less contagious variants of COVID, they said the average person who caught it spreads it to 3 other people. With Omicron, it's undoubtedly higher because it is so much more contagious. Think about those chains. You're the start of the tree, and you branch 4 off, and then each of those 4 branches 4 off. Like, wrap your minds around how quickly this stuff can spread and how much you might be serving your community by taking steps to prevent that spread. Just take it seriously, you guys, please. I'm so tired of the cultural rhetoric surrounding a scientific, medical fucking issue. Okay? And that's where I'll close up on that. But do not make the mistake of thinking the Democrats and the Biden administration are taking this shit seriously, or in any way serving, human lives and people above big business. And by the way, how about the medical profession, you guys, who have now spent 2 years being ravished by this? Imagine being a nurse in a COVID ward. Imagine how careful you have had to be in your life if you're working in a COVID ward. What if you have an elderly grandparent that you have hardly been able to see because you're terrified you're going to spread COVID to them? Think about the impacts that this is having on people's lives. While you desire getting back to normal, what are you doing to the medical field? You're overwhelming hospital capacities. Just think about all of the reverberating effects here, okay? By the way, I mentioned last week that a lot of nurses and medical techs and doctors have kids. So as we send them back to school and create super spreader events in schools, that's undoubtedly going to hit their parents, who then cannot go into work, to their already overloaded hospitals. Think about the reverberating effects here, guys, and take this shit seriously, okay? That's really the point that I want to drive home. So I have a video here from More Perfect Union. We showed during the Vinay interview, we showed the clip that they had kind of summing up the success in moving leverage towards workers' direction over the course of 2021. This is More Perfect Union talking about mergers and how they tend to harm workers. So we will watch this clip and then come back and discuss.
Corporations are giddy over an unprecedented wave of mergers and acquisitions.
M&A has been hot, continues to be hot.
An exciting year for M&A.
Shaping up to be another Merger Monday.
Merger Monday? At last we have one, and I say...
And you'd think, from what we've been told by neoliberal economists, that consolidation is good for the economy.
With this bill, the American financial system takes a major step forward towards the 21st century, one that will benefit American consumers, business, and the national economy for many years to come.
But the reality is different.
Breaking news, though, we've just learned about 230 jobs will be eliminated at Angie's List in connection with the pending merger with Home Advisor.
The papers will merge, resulting in hundreds of jobs gone.
It's a headline that keeps repeating itself in St. Louis, an outside company buying out a major local business,
leaving many wondering whether they'll still have a job when this merger takes place.
Because of the pandemic and policy response, which largely benefited big corporations and banks, financial experts are declaring that an unprecedented merger wave is providing corporations a once-in-a-generation opportunity to make acquisitions and consolidate power. The prevailing wisdom from economic elites claimed that corporate consolidation would lead to more efficiency and lower prices for consumers. But in fact, consolidation gives corporations the power to set higher prices and push wages down. As corporations have grown more powerful, that's given rise to a larger class of billionaires. According to the Harvard Law Review, the average person's salary would be more than $10,000 higher today if employers were less concentrated. Mergers in concentrated markets also result in an average price increase of 7%. And importantly, this consolidation causes job loss. A leading study found there would be 13% more jobs in our economy if it wasn't for widespread monopolization. We at the American Economic Liberties Project looked at local news stories over the last decade to examine what happens after mergers occur. In short, lower wages and fewer good jobs.
Kraft Heinz is slimming down following its merger, and the first to feel the effects of the belt tightening will be the employees.
First Niagara Bank officially files notice of looming layoffs. Hundreds of Connecticut jobs are on the chopping block as a result of First Niagara's merger with New Alliance.
These are transactions that are set to enrich shareholders, corporate officers, and corporate directors.
As part of the deal, 230 people in New Haven and Manchester will lose their jobs. At the same time, some 180 jobs are slated for creation. Banking executives will make millions on the deal.
The company says the merger will eventually save $50 million in operating costs, which means some layoffs, but the company says it is too early to say what jobs will be cut or where.
When corporations merge, they identify redundancies they can eliminate to create cost savings. That's corporate speak for identifying employees that they can fire. In many cases, CEOs even get enormous bonuses when they sell their companies, which we call payoffs for layoffs because of how regularly it leads to people losing their jobs. Here's what needs to happen to fight back against this mounting merger wave. First, we need strong government action to take on these corporate behemoths and enforce existing antitrust law. The Biden administration has taken a great step in nominating Lina Khan, a leading antitrust expert, to fill one of the Federal Trade Commission's open slots. But we'll need more people like Lina on the commission to protect workers, small businesses, and communities from the merger boom. The Biden administration has yet to name someone to lead the Department of Justice's antitrust role. That needs to happen quickly, and it needs to be someone who's not afraid to take corporate America to court. Lastly, Congress has a role to play. It can start by passing merger prohibitions in the giant infrastructure bill that may be passed soon. If Congress doesn't, dominant corporations and private equity firms will have a field day manipulating the use of government money to grow even bigger and stronger at the expense of working people and small businesses all across America.
And I just want to point out, there's also a third category of people who pay for this, and that is the customer. They noted early on, I think they said a 17% increase in costs, or in prices rather, of goods and services resulted from these mergers. So that ties it nicely into a lot of the current narrative surrounding inflation. We talked earlier, a Real Progressives article that by Artemis, go find that on realprogressives.org, by the way, it discussed how inflation is being sort of misrepresented currently, that it's really a result of corporate greed and monopolization, and not a result of too much public spending, which is largely the rhetoric. So we also did, if you missed it a couple of weeks ago, Dr. Fadel Kaboub, who's an economics professor at Denison, he's also the president of the Global Institute for Sustainable Prosperity. If you missed the Zoom call that we did with him, he gave a talk on inflation and then took questions afterwards. You can find that on our YouTube channel. It was fantastic. This kind of ties into that, in that price increase might be viewed as an inflation, but what is it really? It's a monopoly executing its leverage. So there's nothing causing that price to go up. In fact, they're cutting jobs and lowering cost. Meanwhile, they're raising the price. So it's not there's no natural pressure causing that price raise. What it is they can get away with it because they now control a larger portion of the market. So it's just rapaciousness. It's just greed. It's not some sort of natural organic result of economic pressures and dynamics. It's just greed, right? So this is a lot of what we're seeing discussed as though it's inflation nowadays. I've talked a number of times about how the Kroger CEO on a call with investors boasted about how they were passing more than the cost along to the customer, which means they're basically utilizing the customer's expectation of an increase in prices to raise prices even more than necessary to maintain whatever, whatever bottom line they were raking in. So they get to enhance their bottom line, and then they get to turn around and blame public spending. All the while they're raking it in on both sides. They're benefiting on both sides, right? and they continue to monopolize the mergers and acquisitions, all this kind of stuff. So this is also an issue that we have, like, we don't need a change to policy necessarily so much as, I'm sure there are areas where we could improve the policy. I don't want that to be misunderstood. But what we need more than anything is for people to start enforcing the laws that are already on the books. They talked about Khan being appointed there, that she's fantastic. That's one of the very few good things that Biden's administration has done. But she also mentioned how he has left the position that would oversee enforcing antitrust laws vacant for almost a year now. He's almost been in office for a year. So this has been an issue that is entirely ignored. And that's despite the fact, you guys, like, this is actually one of the rare issues where there are quite a few mainstream Democrats who are more on board with enforcing antitrust laws than most of the progressive issues that we talk about. They're certainly not where I would want them to be. Don't get me wrong here. But this seems like an issue where there could have been some actual growth and improvement. And instead, Biden has done very little. So, it's a continuation of the same themes we talk about all the time on this show, how those who currently are benefiting from and enjoying the status quo get a disproportionate say in how we go forward. And of course, their say is going to lean towards maintaining it, right? So we've seen this in all sorts of industries. I talk a lot about the media. There used to be 80 or 90 different outlets that controlled the most consolidated 95% of the market. Now that is 7, and I think it actually went down to 6. I don't know. But in either case, you guys see what's happening here, right? It's a monopolization of the market. And when you consolidate it like that, especially with something like media, you then start really affecting coverage. And media is such a unique industry because so much of society is reliant on having a decent media, right? So that's just one example. All sorts of industries going this route. We just talked about big pharma with the pandemic. They certainly engage in mergers and acquisitions that are beneficial to the shareholders and investors and executives, and to the detriment of the customer and the workers, right? And that is the theme. That is the recurring theme that we see in the business practices of industries all over this country. So great job for More Perfect Union to point it out and sort of detail how I think that one aspect of this that is very misrepresented is the idea that a lot of people seem to think that these mergers and acquisitions are actually for the sake of efficiency. You saw right there, it's not about efficiency. They cut costs and they raise prices. So it's not, the customer doesn't benefit from cheaper prices because of this consolidation. You can't just say, well, we get a cheaper product, so we should all support this. That's insane. It's patently insane. And even if we were getting a better price, you're basically saying fuck all the workers. And I don't think that's a position that anybody should take. So, on all sides of this, corporations get to benefit, and then whenever there is the slightest bit of movement in the other direction, they throw a fit, and we continually see this, right? So I guarantee you, and in fact, when Khan was appointed to the board that she's now on, there was a shit fit from Republicans and corporate Democrats. She almost didn't get confirmed. So, like, anytime there's even the slightest little bit of pressure going in the other direction, they throw their hands up and hoot and holler and bitch and moan, like a bunch of petulant little pathetic children, because that's really what they are. They're a bunch of toddlers, who have never been told no. They've never heard the word no in their entire fucking lives. So, great job from More Perfect Union. If you're not up to date on their work, I encourage you to follow them. They're on Twitter. They're pretty consistently posting videos like that, talking about labor issues, strikes, protests, unionization efforts, all sorts of stuff along those lines. And great work there talking about mergers and acquisitions. So I also wanted to talk a little bit about how Eric Adams, the new mayor of New York, has already fucked things up. Eric Adams is an ex-cop who recently took over for Bill de Blasio in New York City. And he has made a couple of appointments here that are, let's just say, questionable, to say the least. So we're starting off with a Daily Beast article here. Eric Adams appoints brother Bernard as deputy NYPD commissioner. You guys, okay, before we dive into this story, I mean, I just, even if you think, Put yourself in Eric Adams' shoes, okay? You are now the mayor of New York, and there's a lot of spotlight on you. It's a by the way, one of the toughest jobs in politics. That's not to at all defend Eric Adams, but just in reality, it is a difficult job. The New York media, the pressure, the scrutiny, etc. Okay? Put yourself in those shoes. You've just taken over as mayor of New York City. And you think, I think the best person for NYPD commissioner is my brother. You really honestly, genuinely believe that your brother is the most qualified person who would do the best job as NYPD commissioner. You think that, okay? Would you even dream in a million years of appointing your brother to commissioner of NYPD? Of course you wouldn't, because you're not nearly as arrogant and self-centered and spoiled as Eric Adams is. You have a thought in your head that that's nepotism, regardless of how qualified or unqualified your brother is, right? You all understand that, right? How is it that this man and none of his advisors decided, hey, that might be a really bad look? And in a city of millions of people, maybe we can find somebody who's as qualified or more qualified. This is so nonsensical from a PR perspective that you almost think it's like to rub it in everyone's face. It almost feels like it's this very intentional, see, we're going to do whatever the fuck we want, and there's not a damn thing you can do about it. That's how this feels to me, because it's so patently, it's just so brazen. It's so explicit. It's so, anyhow, we'll continue with this piece. He appoints his brother as deputy NYPD commissioner. After just a week on the job, New York City Mayor Eric Adams has appointed his brother Bernard as a. By the way, why does his name have to be Bernard? I mean, I've had my disappointments with Bernie, but his name has to be Bernard. Come on. As a deputy police commissioner, NYPD documents reviewed by the New York Post show Bernard, who formerly served on the NYPD in the position, which comes with a salary of around $240,000. Adams, himself a former NYPD captain, announced the appointment of the Bureau's first ever, look at what they do now, female commissioner, Keishant Sewell, last month. According to Bernard Adams' LinkedIn, he's worked as assistant director for parking at Virginia Commonwealth University since 2011. He appointed the assistant director for parking at a university to NYPD deputy commissioner. Guys, I don't know what everyone else's high schools were like, but we had this dude running security at our school. We had like a cop that was stationed at our high school, and then we had this security guy. Okay. We all called him Sheriff Sean or Sergeant Sean because he had numerous times failed to become a cop, and he was the biggest douche on the planet. He was the guy that wanted to feel like he was powerful because he could write a parking ticket to a 16-year-old. Okay? That's what Eric Adams' brother sounds like to me. And he's been doing that for 10 years. Now we're going to pretend that's qualified to be deputy commissioner of the NYPD. This is a fucking joke. Absolute fucking joke. So it took him less than a week to display how unserious Eric Adams is about serving in any sort of professional way, how unserious he is about upholding even the most basic and rudimentary principles of public office. And that's not the only one that we have on Eric Adams either. This is in New York Magazine. Adams taps ex-cop implicated in bribery scandal to serve in City Hall. Mayor Eric Adams has appointed Philip Banks, a former NYPD chief who was implicated in a bribery scandal, as his deputy mayor for public safety. In his role, Banks would be in charge of coordinating all agencies on public safety matters, according to City Hall, essentially overseeing the police department. His brother, David Banks, currently serves in the administration as the chancellor of schools. So we have double nepotism here. We have two layers of nepotism that Eric Adams is choosing to engage in. The pick is bound to be controversial. No shit. In 2014, federal investigators found that Banks accepted gifts such as foreign trips and expensive meals from a pair of businessmen, Jonah Rechnitz, I apologize if I butchered that name, and Jeremy Reichberg, who were subsequently tried and convicted of attempting to bribe police officials for perks such as fixing parking tickets and other favors. Investigators reportedly found that between 2013 and 14, Banks made a number of bank deposits that totaled up to $300,000. Ultimately, Banks was named as an unindicted co-conspirator in the probe and was not charged with a crime. The announcement of Banks' new role first broke Friday, not in an official City Hall press release, but in an op-ed written by Banks in the New York Daily News, where he attempted to address questions about his past. Banks maintains that he never provided favors to Reichnitz and Reichberg in his official capacity, and said that there was no unexplained income in his financial accounts, noting that the IRS took no actions there. So, you guys, they knew how bad this was going to look, so they announced it by having him write an editorial about it. You cannot make this shit up. This again, I want to say, to make these two moves in your first week as mayor of the largest city in the country is a big middle finger to everybody else. That's, see, I will do what I want and you cannot stop me. That's, see, I'm going to win re-election no matter what, so do something about it. That is just a gigantic middle finger to all of us. That's, I'm Donald Trump with a D next to my name, and I intend to serve my family, and I intend to serve people who I worked with in the past who engaged in bribery scandals, and I intend to let them serve their family. This is Trumpian-esque. Okay. And I like to use that line of argument because the Democrats so object to it, as though they don't engage in the same kind of shit. Just look at Joe and Hunter Biden, right? Is that really that different from Trump and Trump Jr. and Eric and what's the daughter's name? Ivanka. Is it really that different? You know, so they cry foul when they see Donald Trump engaging in nepotism and corruption and ethical violations. And then they turn around and engage in the exact same kinds of ethical violations. How about Manchin and his daughter? Another prime example, right? I mean, you just, the Clintons and Chelsea, and I mean, they're Trumpian. That's what they are. That's what Eric Adams is. And this is a gigantic middle finger to anybody who cares about integrity or principle at all. Anybody who objects to nepotism or corruption, anybody who thinks that cops shouldn't engage in bribery. This is a gigantic middle finger to you. To anybody who has said that the NYPD needs at least reforms. You guys know my position. Defund them, abolish them, and start from scratch. But even if you just think that the NYPD needs reforms, this is a gigantic middle finger to you. This is, we will be the same as we've always been, and fuck you if you disagree. That's what this is. This is arrogance. This is, you know, it's just preposterous. It's absolutely preposterous. So unsurprisingly, Eric Adams here immediately displaying to us all just how unprincipled and unserious he is about being the person that he ran as. So hardly surprising here. We knew what we were getting when Adams unfortunately won election in New York City. There really were no progressives that competed, at least in any serious capacity, for that seat, and that's incredibly unfortunate because it's a very progressive city, and you know, the machine Democratic politics unfortunately demonstrated their power in that election, and now Eric Adams is throwing the middle finger up to anybody who does not like that fact. So we'll continue to watch this, of course, because New York City, very important, not just because there are millions of people there and it's a huge city, but also because it can sometimes be a bit of a forewarning of what's to come, right? In terms of national politics. So shame on Eric Adams and his entire administration, who decided to throw this middle finger up to everybody immediately upon his taking office. And we'll keep up on that story as best we can. So that is all I have for everybody today. I apologize that it was kind of a long stream, but you know, I wanted to make sure not to cut any of the Vinay interview out, and that was an hour and a half. So for those that don't know, we do clip these live streams up into segments. So throughout the week, you can check Real Progress in Action's YouTube channel and find the various segments on various topics, various interviews, etc., put into smaller bits. And I also just want to once again say, please go to realprogressives.org, you guys, for more information and more content. We also very much appreciate any support that you can give. You can find our Patreon there. We are a nonprofit. We're a 501c3 and a 501c4. We do all sorts of education, media, activism, organizing, policy stuff, etc., etc. So please help us out if you can. If you're interested in getting involved with us, you can also find information there at realprogressives.org. We have 2 YouTube channels, guys. I know a lot of you are watching this right now on Real Progress in Action. Please make sure you're subscribed. Make sure you're hitting that like button and leaving a comment so that we can try to defeat the algorithm. And also, please follow and subscribe at Real Progressives, which is more of the educational side of what we do. Tomorrow will be MMT Mondays with Jabari Morris. Don't miss it. Saturdays, Macro and Cheese with our founder and CEO, Steve Grumbine. Don't miss his new show, The Rogue Scholar. First episode out with Jeff Ginter, friend of Real Progressives. And also don't miss Jody Newell's The Up and Up, a show centered around activism, talking with activists from around the country. We have all sorts of great content for you all, and we appreciate your viewership and your support. realprogressives.org if you'd like to get more involved. And with that, I will call it a stream. I hope you all have a wonderful week, and I will see you all next Sunday per usual at 2 Eastern, 11 Pacific.